Section 111 of the Diary of a Russian Lady. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Ted Lienhart. The Diary of a Russian Lady by Barbara Doukhovsky. Chapter 109, Canton. From afar appeared the numerous pagodas of Canton, with their domes adorned with little gold bells. Our boat nosed her way into the crowded river, traversed by a perpetual scurry of launches, and we were at once surrounded by a flotilla of numerous sampans ornamented with golden devices. We were deafened by the screams and the dreadful noise. Canton is a veritable town of amphibians. There is not room enough on land for the 2 million inhabitants who spend all their lives on the water in floating huts. There are families who have never stepped on shore. Their floating houses have platforms on each end, on which their babes pass a part of their lives until the age of 3, tied with a long cord to a post. Canoes propelled by strong Chinese women, clad in broad trousers, come alongside our ship. Some of them carry a baby tied on their backs. The women pile up the luggage and transport passengers on shore, together with long cases of opium, which compose the principal cargo of the BachTran. On landing, we crossed the French bridge leading to the Isle of Shannon and entered the cantonment and the European sections. The Isle of Shannon is a community which consists of a gathering of buildings and gardens forming a kind of European village. Concessions of ground plots are granted by the Chinese government to England, France, America, and Germany. On these diverse pieces of ground, the consulates of the different countries are established. Over each consulate, the national flag is hoisted. The Chinese bear no goodwill towards Europeans, whom they have surnamed devils of the Western countries. One of these days, they threw stones at a party of travelers who were crossing the bridge. Chinese sentinels are placed on both ends of the bridge to keep order, but these warriors of the Celestial Empire inspire but little confidence, and I felt safe only when we stepped into Shannon. It is only the Chinese inhabitants of Shannon who are allowed to cross the French and English bridges leading to the small island. For the natives living in Canton, it is terra prohibita. We put up at the Victoria Hotel. Our room is large and desolate looking. It has but little furniture, 2 uncomfortable little iron bedsteads shrouded with mosquito nets, a table, and 3 chairs. The floor is stone. On the whitewashed walls hangs the portrait of Queen Victoria sitting side by side with our Empress Dowager, holding on her knee her firstborn, Nicholas II. From our window I perceive a corner of the Quay of Canton, from where resounded an appalling noise of tom-toms and cymbals. The French consul came to pay his respects to my husband in the afternoon, accompanied by Mr. Emelianov, a young compatriot of ours who teaches Russian in one of the schools in Canton. We kept them for dinner. The cooking is abominable. Among other unappetizing dishes, we had an underdone beefsteak surrounded with slices of oranges. But the milk products are good. A Dutch settler has brought out of Australia a score of beautiful cows and has established an excellent dairy farm at Shannon. The town of Canton is surrounded by a thick wall. Every street in the city has a gate which is locked at 8 every night. The heavy iron doors are bolted, and no one is allowed to enter or go out of Canton. All the junks and sampans stand in a line along the bank and are strictly forbidden to come alongside Shannon at night. At 9 o'clock in the evening, the guards on the bridges beat the retreat, making a terrible noise with drums, maddening tom-toms and pipes several yards long. Thousands of crackers are let off. To crown all, the retreat ends by loud gunshots. We went to bed in the dark. Our sole light consisted of a piece of candle stuck on a tea saucer. We passed a troublesome, sleepless night, trembling with cold. The dampness mounted from the river by an aperture broken through the ceiling for ventilation. The deafening sound of gongs seemed to rend the air at equal intervals, making noise enough to wake the sleeping beauty. Every quarter of an hour the sound of tom-toms resounded, and immediately after The sentinels sent up their watch cry accompanied by the beating of drums and the ringing of bells. The Chinese make all this noise through superstition to chase away the evil spirit. January 10th. In spite of our fireless, chilly room, we did not escape the bites of vicious mosquitoes and were half devoured by swarms of wretched insects. At 6 o'clock in the morning, a boy naked down to the waist, his long plait rolled round his head, brought us our coffee. It is Sunday today. Being too late for Mass, both in the cathedral and the Protestant church, we went for a walk round Shannon, which took us altogether half an hour. Before the English settlement, joining the French concession, there spreads a large tennis ground. After tiffin, 6 palanquins were at the door to carry us through the town of Canton. Our guide advised us to dress quietly so as not to attract too much attention. Our palanquin carriers, thin, emaciated creatures, started at a small trot. As soon as we had crossed the French bridge and entered Canton, I began to feel seriously uneasy. We were carried through the labyrinth of narrow, muddy, evil-smelling streets crowded with humanity. Pigs and rooks are their only cleaners. Our carriers advanced with difficulty through the crowd, elbowing the people. There is no footway, and at the corners our porters shouted, "Ho, ho, hi, ha," to make the people avoid the path, scattering them to right and left. The streets are full of shops, banners, Chinese lanterns, bizarre signboards hanging down to the ground. On the portico of the houses we saw hideous-faced idols, guardians of the thresholds, to whom the Chinese burned red candles with painted flowers and little incense joss sticks. Joss is a god, to propitiate the demons. A Chinese Punch and Judy were acting on a little stage in a street. We saw legions of lepers at each corner, and were accosted by sordid beings exposing terrible sores. I had a creepy sensation as we passed groups of evil-looking natives eyeing us with evident malevolent curiosity, which threatened to become hostile. Angry murmurs rose behind us. We heard strong epithets used on our behalf. They shouted after us "Fan Ki," which meant dogs of the West, and made menacing gestures. It was old women and children who were the most aggressive. A little boy pulled a tongue a yard long to me. I felt suddenly a hand grasping my arm, and a brutal-looking young Chinaman gave me such a stare that I felt quite uncomfortable. I endeavored to look unconcerned, but did not know what to do all the same, whether to smile or to maintain a stern countenance. I heaved a sigh of relief when our carriers stopped before the Pagoda of the 500 Geniuses, which contains life-sized statues made of gilded wood, one more grotesque than the other, placed on granite pedestals. An idol with 6 eyes and ears down to the neck, poured down from 4 pairs of hands his blessings. Another with 3 faces held a sort of mandolin in his hands. A statue with European features and clothes, wearing a Rembrandt hat, personified Marco Polo, the renowned Venetian explorer of the 16th century, the first European who penetrated into China. I wonder how that personage had come to attain the rank of a god. We were carried afterwards to the Roman Catholic Cathedral, where Christian natives, in Chinese dress, knelt near the altar listening to the litanies sung in Chinese language by a priest wearing the Chinese costume. We went slowly round the cathedral and admired the beautiful stained glass windows in which figures of saints stood, and paintings representing diverse subjects from the Bible adapted to Chinese life. The figure of Christ blessing a Chinese woman with children clinging to her skirts especially attracted our attention. I was delighted when we were brought back to Shannon. End of section 111. Section 112 of the Diary of a Russian Lady. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Ted Lienhart. The Diary of a Russian Lady by Barbara Doukhovsky. Chapter 110, Macao. January 11th. This morning we took our passage to Macao on an English steamer named the White Cloud. I turned my back to Canton with great pleasure. I think China is a frightful country, and I wish I had never set foot in it. After 8 hours of crossing, the Portuguese peninsula came to view. We saw about 100 cannons in the high forts, protecting Macao from the side of the sea. 200 years have gone by since the shores of Macao, the oldest European colony in the Orient, were first visited by Europeans. In 1720, the Portuguese landed and took possession of it in the name of their sovereign. The front of the town bears the inscription in Portuguese, Cita del Nome de Dios, now ha otra más leal. City in the name of God, there does not exist a more loyal one. On the quay, men besieged us with their cards and prospectuses, each of them trying to lead us into the hotel that they were charged to represent. We took a Chinese interpreter called Foon, who spoke a few words of English and promised to show us all the sights of Macao. He took us to the Hotel Hing Key, standing on the marine esplanade called Praia Grande, where a military band plays every evening. The hotel is built Portuguese fashion, with a gallery running around the four sides of the patio leading into the various rooms. The gallery is divided in several parts by wooden partitions communicating by doors, which we opened, appropriating thus the whole gallery. Outside the air is mild, but it is very cold indoors. We were obliged to have a fire. In front of our hotel, a boat belonging to the Portuguese customs is moored. The opposite shore belongs to China. January 13th. We went about all day in palanquins, seeing the sights of Macao. Nearly all the streets bear clerical names: Rua Padre Antonio, Callada de Bon Jesus, Traversa de San Agosto. Macao is a very pretty town. The houses are generally not more than 1 story high, most of them painted blue, pink, or yellow, with green shutters and terraces instead of roofs, all having overhanging balconies reaching out to one another in friendly wise across the narrow streets, which swarm with Chinamen, who, contrary to their fellow countrymen in Canton, look very peaceful. One of the particular features of the streets of Macao is the abundance of Portuguese priests wearing long black beards and women enveloped from head to foot in black mantillas. The natives of Macao are not attractive looking. They are a race of half-castes, Portuguese father and Chinese mother, resembling orangutans with their prominent jaws. Fon suggested that we should visit a silk manufactory where about 600 Chinese women were employed. Their superintendent, a fat Portuguese dame with a cigarette between her lips, forbade our gentlemen to pass before the rows of workwomen. After showing us through a dozen rooms, Fon brought us into a large hall where numbers of Chinese coolies in Adam-like dress except the rag vine leaf were occupied in boiling silk cocoons. We were carried from the manufactory to the frontier of Macao and China. Our porters clambered up the stony ladder staircases, bearing the name of streets, which are all 2 yards broad, veritable corridors paved with sharp stones, with grass growing between them. We passed through the Chinese quarters of the town, where all the fronts of the houses have recesses containing grotesque-looking idols with twisted legs, the gods of prosperity, before which incenses are burned. Here we are on the frontier called Porta Portuguese. Chinese soldiers guard the boundary. After having set foot on Chinese ground, we were carried back to Macao by a winding staircase-like path and passed before the grotto of Louis Camões, the celebrated Portuguese poet of the 16th century, exiled in the year 1556 for his daring liberal ideas. The great poet, who had been shipwrecked in these inhospitable seas, gained the shore of this newly founded Portuguese colony and took refuge in a grotto situated in a chaotic assemblage of rocks in the hollow of a dale, where a monument has been erected to his memory. The site is desolate and wild, looking upon the Chinese Empire and the ocean, where there is no land before the icy polar regions. Camões lamented here his life of exile and glorified his country in verse. By the side of the monument, on a large stone, a book is sculptured in the rock, bearing the names of all the works of the great poet. Before returning to the hotel, we went to a Chinese photographer to have our group taken in palanquins. Our carriers were quite amusingly afraid of the apparatus, it being against the teaching of their religion to have their pictures taken, especially together with white-faced men. They paused, undecided what to do, to fly or to remain, and the next moment they suddenly disappeared. Look where we would, we could in no manner discover them, and had our group taken sitting in palanquins placed on the ground. Macao is a sort of Monte Carlo of the East, where the principal industry is play. All the numerous gambling saloons are kept by Chinamen. After dinner, Foon took us to one of these playhouses, where a risky game named Fonton goes on. We sat over the gambling tables on the top of a gallery where the game is carried on also. Our gambling neighbors put their stakes into a basket which was dropped down into the hall by the means of a long cord. We saw a venerable white-bearded Chinese croupier take a handful of counters which he placed on the middle of the table and began to count them with a long rod. I also tried my fortune and lost $1. Things are done here very unceremoniously, our croupier feeling hot, undressed, and remained almost without clothes. I wanted very much to see opium smokers, and Foon led us by a queer old back street to a bamboo barrack where a score of half-naked Chinamen lay on the floor in different stages of intoxication produced by the effect of opium, with ghastly smiles, their faces expressing the ecstatic delight of extraordinary bliss, the hashish carrying them away into paradisical dreams. Beside each smoker a small cocoa oil lamp was burning to light their long pipes saturated with opium. After 2 or 3 puffs, the smokers fell into ecstasies and swoon away, showing the white of the eyes and looking altogether horrible. The smoke in the room blinded me, and my head swam from the nasty smell of the opium. January 14th. Today we visited the seminary of San Paula, built by the Jesuits. When we entered the cathedral, a young Irish monk in the brown habit of the Franciscan order, girded with a thick cord, came towards us, breviary in hand, clinking his sandals on the flagstones. He took my husband and his companions to show them over the seminary. He said that ladies are not admitted within the walls of the seminary, and I had to remain in the cathedral with Maria Mikhailovna. We went over the church and read all the inscriptions, after which we became a little bored and were pleased when our gentleman came back, accompanied this time by the prior of the seminary, a gray-bearded Portuguese padre, round-faced and benevolent, who happened to be less Puritan than his young colleague, and invited me to come and drink a glass of Malaga in the refectory, but I refused point-blank this time. We were back at the hotel just in time for the table d'hôte. After dinner we went to the pier, where we admired the phosphorescence of the sea, produced by the myriads of animalcules with which the ocean is infested at certain periods. The evening was fine and the air very mild. When we passed before the governor's abode, a sort of pavilion surrounded by a small garden named Villa Flora, we seated ourselves on a broad stone parapet and listened to the band playing in the patio of the villa. How jolly it was to throw etiquette to the winds and feel like simple mortals. January 15th. This afternoon my husband called upon the governor, who returned his visit an hour later. As to me, I exchanged visiting cards with his wife. January 16th. This morning we left for Hong Kong on the boat Sha. Our steamer tugged a barge loaded with cases of opium for the sum of 40,000 Mexican dollars. The cargo will be transshipped afterwards onto another boat bound for the Sandwich Islands and San Francisco. Our steamer is escorted by a detachment of Portuguese soldiers. After 3 hours' sail, we arrived at Hong Kong. End of section 112. Section 113 of the Diary of a Russian Lady. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Ted Lienhart. The Diary of a Russian Lady by Barbara Doukhovsky. Chapter 111, Hong Kong. January 17th. The weather is very bad. The rain is falling in torrents. This morning a boy brought me, instead of tea, a tepid, undrinkable potion as black as ink. When I told him to add some water to my tea, he found nothing better but to mix it with water that he had taken from the top of our bath, and then, wanting to convince himself that my tea was not too hot, he put his dirty finger into my cup. It is Sunday today. After breakfast, we were carried in palanquins to St. John's Cathedral, where English ladies sang prayers in chorus. Maria Mikhailovna made us laugh at tiffin. Each time when the boy handed her the menu to point out the extras, she repeated mechanically in Russian, "Vot ito," which means, "give me that," and the boy, confounding the sound of "vot ito" with potato, served her with each course a perpetual supply of potatoes, even with ice cream. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, we attended the evening service at the cathedral. This time the chorus consisted of Chinamen. A young Mexican padre mounted a pulpit and began preaching a long sermon in Portuguese language. As we did not understand what he said, we returned to the hotel, where we found visiting cards left for us by General Wilson Black, the commander of the English troops at Hong Kong, who had called upon us with his wife and daughter. The Selassie has arrived this morning, and tomorrow we sail on that ship for Saigon. January 18th. We went on board directly after lunch. All the passengers were still on land, except a buxom Russian nurse, who was rocking in her arms a squalling baby. There are 9 families of Russian Marine officers on board. My husband was invited to dinner with his suite at General Wilson Black's, but I refused the invitation and locked myself up in my cabin until Sergei's return. In the saloon next to my cabin, I heard the officers, who had returned on board by this time, flirting with Mademoiselle Jean Mougan, a pretty French girl, full of animation and merriment, with a face all laughter and dimples, with whom I made acquaintance on deck in the evening. Sergei described to me in detail the dinner party at the Wilson Blacks. Everything was done in grand style. The table, set out with silver plate and crystal, was beautifully decorated with flowers. After dinner, Miss Lily, the general's daughter, sang English songs, accompanying herself on the guitar. January 19th. We weighed anchor at noon. The sea is very rough, and I remained in bed all day, preparing myself for a bad crossing. January 20th. It begins to get hot. The double doors of the dining room are taken off, and the piano is brought out on the deck. The passengers have put on their white clothes for dinner. We are approaching the equator zone and pass the street of Tonkin by moonlight. January 21st. The heat is intense. Towards midday, we enter the Saigon River. End of section 113.
Section number 114 of the Diary of a Russian Lady. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by BachTran. The Diary of a Russian Lady by Barbara Doukhovsky. Saigon. At 4 o'clock, we are at Saigon. We put up at Hotel Continental, the top flat of which is occupied by the Krakow Colonial. We dined at the table d'hôte. The dining room was thronged with officers from the Continental Infantry, dressed all in white, who quarters in the garrison. They were very gay and talked all at once. After dinners, we went to the opera. The performance was La Vie d'un Héroïne, and the singer very good. The theaters looked very elegant, the men all in white, the ladies in low gown. Between the act, we went to eat ice on the boulevards. Hindus draped in white, with a blue tattoo mark on the forehead, promenaded before us. Toward midnight, we were back on board. January 22nd. We left the harbors of Saigon at 7 in the morning. When the tide was in, we passed before a huge English and German cargo ship anchors in lines along the bank of the river. It is terribly hot. We all are at roasting point. January 23rd. Full calm. Intolerable heat. End of section 114. Read by BachTran.
Section 115 of The Diary of a Russian Lady. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Jennifer Beckett Wood. The Diary of a Russian Lady by Barbara Doukhovsky. Singapore, January the 24th. It was night when the Salassi came in sight of Singapore. We are going to stop here about a fortnight, waiting for the Laos, a French boat bound to Colombo and Marseille. We put up again at the Hotel d'Europe. January the 25th. An English officer and his family occupy the apartment next door to ours. The children are shamefully spoilt by their mother, who never reproves them. They can't keep quiet 1 minute and get into everybody's way, getting hideous sounds out of 2 combs and beating the drum into our ears. When they were attacked by a fit of bad humour, nobody could approach them in safety. They lay down on the floor and kicked and howled. Their manners at table d'hôte were of the worst, for they made as much noise as they could with their spoons and knives. I found this morning the youngest of the family, the best-loved child, an extremely troublesome little Saxon, beating his ayah, nurse, with the leg of his rocking horse, which had come off. That insupportable brat had been instantly dispatched to bed by his father. The room opposite to us is occupied by a Dutch opera singer who is going on a tour to Siam. I heard her practicing her exercises the whole morning. January the 26th. Our consul, Mr. Klimanoff, is awfully nice to me. Today he sent to me a bottle of milk, a rarity in these parts. January the 28th. It is dreadfully hot. The tropical rain, which falls from time to time, does not refresh the air. Sergei intended to make an excursion to Bangkok, but the signals of tempest are hoisted in the port, and I am wickedly pleased, for Sergei will remain at home. January the 29th. The young Sultan of Johor paid an unexpected call to us in the afternoon, a fabulous creature, all covered with diamonds. This Hindu prince is enormously rich, the greatest part of Malacca belonging to him. Opposite our windows spreads a spacious lawn and pleasure grounds, where Englishmen, who carry their habits with them in all parts of the world, give themselves up to every kind of outdoor sport, golf, cricket, tennis, etc. The players look very nice in their white flannels and blue caps. In Singapore it is the Chinese who possess the largest fortunes. The whole commerce of the place is in their hands. Every evening the Chinese merchants, after having ended their business in the city, drive round the esplanade in smart carriages drawn by big Australian horses, with a white groom on the back seat. February the 5th. It is my birthday today. Our consul gave me for my birthday gift a large basket with enormous cocoa nuts filled with milk. This native beverage is very cool and refreshing. The Hindu colony of Singapore invited us to be present at a great annual festivity in honour of Siva, the god of good and evil. The whole town rushed to the famous heathen temple from which the procession was to proceed. We saw an enormous chariot of carved silver advancing, drawn by 2 sacred white bulls covered with rich clothes, shining with gold embroideries and spangles, their legs and horns decorated with bracelets. We were told that the chariot cost $80,000. It held the statue of the Hindu Trinity, Brahma, Vishnu, and Siva, crowned with flowers. A great throng of natives, their faces and hands daubed with ashes, in the simplest of costumes, a mere white linen band, 5 fingers wide, passing round the hips, escorted the chariot, holding lighted torches. We left our shoes in charge of a turbaned man and proceeded to the temple, to which many thousands of people came from all parts to pay their vows. Thousands of pilgrims crowded through the gates, all straining towards the enclosure of the temple. About 60 men, dressed in white, beat tom-toms and howled in a piercing voice. We were deafened by the hideous music. We entered a magnificent hall, full of enormous columns, lit by Arabian lamps with glass panes framed in carved copper. On the floor stood a big copper incense burner, loading the atmosphere with perfume. The interior of the temple is a veritable bazaar. A fantastic crowd surrounded us. They beat the drums, they sang, they danced. A group of bonzes, priests, naked to the waist, girded with a thick cord, came up to pour strong perfume on our hands and offered us armfuls of fragrant jasmine, which spread a violent odour all over the temple. I was somewhat scared by all this noise and giddy with the scent of crushed flowers heaped on the floor. February the 6th. Today my husband went with his suite to visit the Rottger of Johore in his dominions on the coast of Malacca. It took them 2 hours to reach his states. They crossed the strait that divides Singapore from Johore in a steamboat and made the rest of the journeys in rickshaws. The Rajah wasn't at home. My husband, nevertheless, was shown over the palace, which had nothing remarkable about it. Numbers of articles, without any artistic value, were heaped up in the apartments. Sergei lunched at the Johore Club, from which he sent me a letter with a Johore post stamp for my collection. February the 7th. I was awakened this morning by a voice proceeding from the corridor, wildly vociferating, "My money! I want my money!" It was an American traveller who had been robbed at the hotel of the sum of $11,000. He had gone down for breakfast, and when he returned some minutes later, he found the drawer forced and his money gone. The police was summoned and his apartment turned upside down. The portfolio was found out under the mattress, and one of the boys, serving at the hotel, confessed to the robbery and was marched off to jail. I saw a constable dragging the culprit by his long tail, whilst the whole household regaled him with blows and kicks. End of section 115. Section 116 of The Diary of a Russian Lady. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Jennifer Beckett Wood. The Diary of a Russian Lady by Barbara Doukhovsky. From Singapore to Suez. February the 9th. Today we take our passage on the Laos. A Prussian officer with an unpronounceable name, who was stopping with us at the hotel, came on board to see us off. He had just returned from a tour in Sumatra, where cannibalism still exists, and narrated to us, with Teutonical phlegm, his experiences among man-eaters. In that barbarian country, the tribes engaged in war eat their prisoners. Those who slaughter them are also risking their life, for if one single drop of blood falls upon the executioner, he is devoured in his turn. This officer brought back from Sumatra the head and the hands of a man who had been eaten in his presence. Ugh! The horror! The Laos is a veritable floating palace. There are about 100 first-class passengers on board. I found some old acquaintances from the Salasy, Mademoiselle Jean Mougin amongst them, merry and pleasant as ever. She threw herself stormingly upon my neck. I was very pleased in my turn to have such a gay companion during our crossing. The steamer included among its passengers a nuncio of the Pope, a Pole, Zaleski by name, a high personage of the church, who will soon be appointed to the rank of cardinal. He inhabits Kandy and is now making the round of his diocese. Monseigneur, as he is called on board, wears a broad violet waistband over his black cassock. He is awfully nice, without a particle of bigotry. He told me, as we paced up and down the long deck, that he had been very fond of society in the days of his youth, and that it had been extremely hard for him to take final vows and to part with his moustache. February the 12th. After dinner, everyone who had pretensions to music played or sang in the salon. The wife of a French officer, who was returning to Toulon after having ended his military service in Cochin China, favoured the company with arias and cavatinas. The lady is very smart and elegant, but her warbling does not suit her plumage, her musical gifts not being of an extraordinary order. At first she was somewhat nervous, and in her agitation dropped all her notes. Another would-be prima donna, an old hen that imagined that she could crow, and whose singing would make the dogs howl, with many simpers began to squeak love songs as high as she could reach, with a voice particularly discordant with tune. She accompanied herself on the piano and thumped the poor instrument enough to destroy the keys. Her performance put my teeth on edge, and I cast her no tender glances. But my neighbour, a meagre, exalted German lady, went into raptures, showing the whites of her eyes and repeating, "Vamos, colossal!" A pretentious and bad pianist took her place and massacred, with the greatest assurance, one of Chopin's most beautiful compositions. After the pianist, a young girl sat down at the piano, whose musical gift didn't go further than La Prière d'une Vierge. After 2 hours of such anti-musical performance, the salon emptied little by little, and her solo was executed, so to speak, to empty seats. February the 13th. We arrived at Colombo this morning and immediately took passage on the Armand Beig, an ocean liner sailing to Suez from Australia. We have abandoned the Laos to avoid the quarantine at Bombay, where the ship was to stop. Nearly all her passengers passed over on the Armand Beig. There were many Australians and Japs on board, and some French officers who were returning from Tonkin, very pale and suffering, whilst the Australians are all blooming with health. There were different sets, of course, among a throng of 400 passengers. There was the gay set, who got up plays and dances on board, the cultured set, the musical set, etc., etc. A concert with tombola is being got up on board for the benefit of the families of the sailors who have perished at sea. A subscription has been started amongst the first-class passengers. I consented to take part in the concert and to play a solo on the concertina. Active preparations are made. The piano of the salon has been screwed down to the floor. The piano of the second class was carried out on the deck, which is transformed into a veritable concert hall. February the 14th. In the afternoon we all went to draw the lottery. A jolly French colonel took upon himself to be auctioneer at the tombola. He presided with extraordinary gravity, hammer in hand, and kept the whole company alive by puffing his wares unblushingly. The programmes of our concert, painted by one of the Australian lady passengers, were sold by auction, 12 francs each. The bids rose finally to 40 francs. Our concert yielded about 1,500 francs. The evening wound up with a ball. Between the dances, tea and all sorts of refreshments were being carried round by sailors. I had no notion of the hour and found it was 3 o'clock when I went to bed. February the 15th. The Chinese element has disappeared on board, but in return the number of Hindus, Malays and Arabs have increased. They are all on the fore and aft of the ship, piled up on heaps of luggage. Our boat has brought a parcel bearing my address at St. Petersburg, postmarked Sydney. The message over the seas was a book written by Orion, an Australian doctor who had served in the Turkish army during the Russian-Turkish War, whom I had met many years ago at Erzurum. The book is entitled Under the Red Crescent. It mentioned in it that the author had fallen in love with me at first sight and could not forget me till now. It was a strange coincidence that the book travelled in the same mailbag going to the same country, and it was very queer, this unexpected discovery of an Australian adorer of long vanished times. February the 16th. Our list of acquaintances has increased on board. There is among the passengers a Creole family bound to Marseille, Cremazie by name. Mr. Cremazie has occupied for a long time the post of President of the Court of Justice at Saigon. His pretty daughters, Mademoiselle Paul and Blanche, were born in the colonies and represent the real Creole type. They are very pleasant girls, and in a few days we have become fast friends. Another French girl, Mademoiselle Louise Martel, is an invalid. She lay back in her deck chair all day amidst a pile of pillows, carefully wrapped in a thick shawl, though exposed to the rays of a tropical sun. She is dying of consumption and looks very ill and sad, her face drawn and sharpened by suffering. The poor young creature is cold and indifferent to everyone. She took a fancy to me, nevertheless, and today, when I came up to bid her good morning, her face lit up with a poor, sickly little smile. As a contrast to the young invalid, we have a jolly opera singer on board, who flirts and appropriates all the passengers of the unfair sex. She especially set her cap at Mr. Shaniavsky and bored him with requests to accompany her vicious little songs. There is a particularly nice young man on board, an Australian, according to the information of the head steward. He didn't stare at me during the meals, he was too well bred, but when I looked the other way, he looked at me. He sketched caricatures wickedly well, and I asked him to make a drawing of me, but it wasn't a caricature at all. Too flattering, I should say. Today the young man made a rush for a seat near me at table. I had noticed that he had put on a becoming tie adorned with a pin with a beautiful opal set in it, which I had imprudently admired, and which had cost a considerable sum of money. After dinner he came up to me and laid in my lap a little vellum box. In it was the famous opal pin, which he tried to make me accept as a souvenir. But of course I refused his offering, telling him that in Russia the opal is considered an unlucky stone. He was awfully vexed and sulked the whole evening, following me with eyes of gloomy disappointment. The Australian endeavoured to throw himself in my way everywhere. He passed beside the windows of my cabin when he couldn't catch me elsewhere. I was not quite indifferent to the adventure, for he was very attractive, that young Australian. But it appears that I was playing with fire. He placed himself close to me on deck this evening, and taking my hand, which he retained in his grasp, his eyes speaking a number of things to me, he began to talk of love, murmuring a torrent of passionate words. He told me of the sleepless nights he spent in thinking of me, and said I had cast a kind of spell upon him, and that since the hour he had seen me, he had thought only of how he might see me again. His attentions became so pressing that I found it time to put a stop to them. "I think, if you don't mind," I said to him heartlessly, whilst he was talking of his flame to me, "that I'd rather speak of the weather." He didn't look pleased, the poor boy, I must say. February the 20th. We are crossing today the Strait of Bab el Mandeb, the Gate of Tears. The mariners try to pass this dangerous place by daylight. There has been a great deal of cricket playing this afternoon on board. It seems a queer game for a ship, but the promenade deck has nettings to keep the balls from flying overboard. For dinner, the Australians dressed as if for a ball, the ladies in low dresses, the gentlemen in smokings. The cuisine is very good on board. All the provisions are brought from Australia. The Australian passengers monopolised the salon after dinner, sitting there as if the whole place belonged to them. Someone played the piano, and they all sang Australian songs in chorus. February the 21st. The air is cool and fresh, and the Japanese passengers begin to freeze. In Australia it is summer in November, December, January and February, and thus our Australian passengers, going out to Europe for 12 months, will enjoy summer the whole year round. February the 22nd. The monotony of our crossing has begun to weary everyone. The passengers saw far too much of each other, and the good understanding between them was cooling down. They began to pick quarrels with each other and lived in strife for the remainder of the voyage. End of section 116. Section 117 of the Diary of a Russian Lady. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Jennifer Beckett Wood. The Diary of a Russian Lady by Barbara Doukhovsky. Suez. We were obliged to take leave of our pleasant steamer friends at Suez. I was very sorry to part with the Kremazis, who hoped we might meet again and promised to write to me from time to time. When it came to saying goodbye to my Australian admirer, he hurt my hand squeezing it, and pressing my fingers made me cry, whilst he expressed his despair at parting from me. We lowered a boat that carried us on shore. When we entered it, my Australian waved his farewell tome and shouted from the deck, "I am so sorry to lose you." We had the intention on arriving at Suez to make an excursion along the banks of the Nile and then to catch the Laos at Port Saïd. When we set foot on African soil, the train for Cairo had already started, and we were obliged to wait patiently until the next day. We set out piano pianissimo through the intense heat to seek rooms at the Hotel Continental. Suez is in the full carnival. Masked groups walk about the streets. A man dressed like a cook, holding an immense saucepan in which he was stirring with a big spoon a sort of gruel, sprinkled with this nasty mixture all the passers-by, shouting, "Vive la France!" Knowing that he was at our heels, we hastened to the hotel. End of section 117. Section 118 of the Diary of a Russian Lady. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Jennifer Beckett Wood. The Diary of a Russian Lady by Barbara Doukhovsky. Cairo. February the 24th. We started for Cairo with the first train and followed for a long time the Suez Canal. We are rolling now by the side of the Nile. The passengers, their faces at the windows, are looking out for the pyramids. We came in sight of one pyramid, and 10 minutes afterwards we enter Cairo station. The winter season at Cairo was in full swing. The city was full of tourists, and it was difficult to find a shelter. We made a tour of the hotels, but not a single room was to be had. "Full up," came the curt reply. We went to Shepherd's Hotel, and the next hotel, and the next to that, and received the same answer everywhere. At last we found shelter at the Hotel Bristol, but for 2 days only, as all the apartments were already let to a number of American tourists who were to arrive with the next boat from Alexandria. February the 25th. The chances were that we should remain at Cairo for some days to come. We had just been informed that we must wait a whole week to catch the Laos at Port Saïd. Directly after breakfast we set to work to find lodgings, which was not an easy thing to do. At last we got apartments, consisting of a bedroom and a sitting room, in the second floor of a private house, where we were made as comfortable as circumstances would allow. We'll pay 5 shillings a day for our board and lodging. Our travelling companions have found rooms in the same house. February the 26th. I am laid up with a bad cold and look hideous, with my nose twice its size and my eyes half theirs. I wonder if my Australian admirer would keep faithful to me if he saw me just now. Sergei wanted absolutely to send for the doctor, but I said that it was quite unnecessary and had my own way. Sergei, with all our travelling companions, went to the pyramids this afternoon, and I felt very lonely all by myself at home. I listened to the chant of the muezzin calling for prayers from many a minaret, and at the same time from the Esbekay gardens came the music of the native military band playing Arabian airs. February the 28th. When the morning came, I was burning with fever and could not raise my head from the pillow, but the Laos had arrived at Port Said, and we must leave Cairo today absolutely. It will not suit my cold, to be sure. Before leaving, I swallowed a large dose of quinine. The railway line leading to Port Said is very narrow and looks more like a tramway line. The road ran close along the Suez Canal. A steamer crawled by close at hand as our train wheezed on from Ismailia to the coast. We soon left the ship behind us. Our way lay now through sugar-cane and cotton fields. I felt very unwell all the time and lay stretched on my narrow bench, feeling very miserable. Notwithstanding the large dose of quinine, my temperature was up and I was shivering with fever. I hope I shall not fall seriously ill. End of section 118. Section 119 of The Diary of a Russian Lady. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Jennifer Beckett Wood. The Diary of a Russian Lady by Barbara Doukhovsky. Port Said. We were at Port Said at 6 o'clock in the evening. As soon as we arrived at the hotel, I got to bed at once. February the 29th. I kept my bed the whole day. It is carnival time, and the streets are full of laughing crowds dressed in fantastic costumes, who showered confetti on each other. I could see from my bed all that was going on in Lesseps Square. Sergei went out for a walk and returned accompanied by an Italian youth with a performing monkey arrayed in a red jacket and fez perched upon his shoulder. The ugly little animal, whilst turning somersaults, was watching slyly the opportunity to jump upon my bed. March the 1st. We had to go on board the Laos in the middle of the night. I did not at all like to be turned out of my warm bed and felt so miserably weak that I could hardly stand on my feet. We rocked on the waves in a small rowing boat for more than an hour, awaiting permission to step on board the Laos at the appointed hour. A little fleet of barges loaded with coal surrounded us. Their close neighbourhood made us look like chimney sweeps. When we mounted the Laos, we were as black as negroes. March the 2nd. The gradual lowering of the temperature is very sensible. Since yesterday, the punkahs in the salon had ceased to work, and the light dresses and straw hats on board have been replaced by warm coats and woolens of all kinds. The wind is getting fresher, and the sea begins to ripple. It is the Mistral coming on. We are rolling terribly on the Mediterranean. It is not at all jolly, especially with the perspective of quarantine at Marseille. During the stay of the Laos at Bombay, many new passengers boarded the ship, amongst them a rich Indian nabob with a face like a wicked monkey, who is going to London to be presented to the Queen. He is dressed in European garb, which doesn't suit him at all, and makes him look more like an ape than a human being. But the Hindu was thoroughly unconscious of his own deficiencies. He sat next to Mr. Shaniavsky at dinner and found fault with all the passengers during the repast, especially with those belonging to the yellow race, and said that the Chinese and the Japs were all monkey-faced creatures. And he himself Who does he look like, I should like to know? March the 5th. Thank God we are close to Marseille. At 7 o'clock in the morning the washing of the deck was already over and the boat had put on her best toilet. At 10 the French coasts were in sight. Shall we be able to come into the harbour, or shall we be confined to quarantine? That is the question which preoccupies us all. Hurrah! The sanitary state of our boat is declared satisfactory and we are permitted to land. We decided to rest one day at Marseille at the Hôtel de Noé. I could think of nothing else but bed and the bliss of laying my ailing body down to rest between clean sheets that smelt of lavender. March the 7th. We are on our way to Paris. I am so happy to see the miles added to miles and the distance separating me from darling St. Petersburg decreasing visibly. The whole country is covered with a deep mantle of snow. I wanted snow so badly in the tropics and must be satisfied now. End of section 119.
Section 120 of the Diary of a Russian Lady. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Ted Lienhart. The Diary of a Russian Lady by Barbara Doukhovsky. St. Petersburg. We are back from our exile, home in Russia. At last our wanderings have come to an end. We have crossed the globe almost in all directions by land and sea, but I know of no place as dear as St. Petersburg. We are staying at the Grand Hotel and have had such a good time since we came here, and no end of a better one in prospect. I feel myself free of all constraint and etiquette. All my words and acts are not taken up and discussed as at Khabarovsk. We were full of lovely plans for spending the summer abroad, but man proposes and circumstances master him. We have just been at St. Petersburg for a week when an event occurred which upset all our plans. My husband was offered, quite unexpectedly, the brilliant post of Governor General of Turkestan, a territory in Central Asia between Siberia and Afghanistan. He accepted the post. I was awfully taken by the rapidity of the events. It gave me quite a shock. All my little castles in the air have been shattered at one blow, and my daydreams have come to nothing. It was such a sorrow for me to leave St. Petersburg, and a great sacrifice to give up going abroad. I am so tired of being a bird of passage, hunting about from place to place until I could scream for rest, leading a life of constant travel in overheated trains and on rolling seas. And we are obliged now to undertake another long journey. A new existence is in store for us at the other extremity of our spacious native country. A new home, a new life. What will it be like? But the die is cast. There is nothing to do but submit. I must be reasonable and look the matter fairly in the face and endeavor to take a philosophic view of what can't be helped. It is said in a Persian sacred book, the Zend-Avesta, written 200 years before Christ, that Turkestan is one of the most ancient cradles of humanity. Tashkend, our new home, is a city 1,000 years old. It was captured in 1865 by General Chernihiv. That country is as big as France and England put together and has a population of 8 millions. The Emir of Bokhara, Saïd Abdul-ul-Akkad Khan, announced to my husband by wire his forthcoming arrival at St. Petersburg. He came to call on us, accompanied by his ministers, speechless with awe and veneration in his presence. The sovereign of Bokhara was very magnificently clad in a superb collet of brocade, a long robe cut straight, girded with a silver sash, wearing on his head a turban studded with precious stones, his breast adorned with decorations. When the official compliments were exchanged, it was my turn to entertain the emir with the aid of an interpreter. Somewhat at a loss to open a conversation, I was trying to think of something to say that was suitable for the situation, and nearly began to make unnecessary announcements about the weather. In taking leave, the emir bestowed on my husband the Bokharian order studded with big diamonds, and that same day there came a package for me from the emir, a golden case containing a beautiful necklace of massive gold of the finest oriental work, inlaid with precious stones. It is impossible to postpone our journey to Tashkend any longer, my husband being called to his new post of duty because of the disturbances taking place in Andijan, the capital of Fergan, a district of Turkestan. During the night from the 17th to 18th May, a revolt burst out. A band of Mussulmans, about 1,000 men, under the command of their Ishan Mahomet Ali Halif, attacked the camp of our garrison from the side of the village Don Kishlak, adjoining the camp. The natives crept stealthily to the first barrack in which our soldiers were sleeping peacefully and began to cut their throats. Starting up out of their sleep, the men of the neighboring barracks drove their assailants back with the points of their bayonets. All the camp was soon astir, and the Mussulmans retreated, carrying away their wounded. The imam, a pilgrim from Mecca, was one of the first to be killed, whilst he was reading the Koran to the rioters, who, in attacking our garrison, had planned the extermination of the whole Russian population and putting everything to fire and sword after having taken possession of our camp. The agitation in the country has settled down, and active measures are taken against the rebels. The Ishan is sentenced to death, together with the principal mutineers, whilst 500 natives will be exported to penal servitude to the Isle of Saigon. I do pity these poor fanatics. Legends are told about this Ishan. The story goes that sometime before the last rebellion, a message from the Sultan had delivered to him a venerable relic, the hair and beard of the Prophet, with a permission to commence a sacred war against the infidels. The population of Fergan, recently submitted to Russia, had attempted several times to raise a general rebellion against the Russians, nourishing towards them an implacable hatred. My husband will have to take strong measures to avoid a new outburst. End of section 120. Section 121 of the Diary of a Russian Lady. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Ted Lienhart. The Diary of a Russian Lady by Barbara Doukhovsky. Our Journey to Tashkend. May 26. We started for Tashkend today. I will return to St. Petersburg in September to confer about the publishing of my memories, which I issue for the benefit of the Gymnasium of Young Ladies at Tashkend. It is a long and tedious journey from St. Petersburg to Tashkend. We have to cover 4,600 miles to reach our new, faraway abode. A crowd of people had come to see us off and stood before the car which was put at our disposal as far as Petrovsk, one of the largest ports of the Caucasus. The next car was reserved for my husband's suite. The hour for departure approached. The train is moving and carrying us away on our long journey. I left St. Petersburg in a flood of tears. May 30th. We arrived at Petrovsk at 8 o'clock in the morning and took passage on the Alexis, a boat bound to Krasnovodsk, the chief port of the Transcaspian provinces. We weighed anchor at 10 o'clock. Our voyage began under favorable auspices. The weather is very mild. Not the slightest breeze ruffles the smooth surface of the water. But unfortunately, in even the most splendid weather, the rolling is felt in the Caspian Sea. May 31st, 9 o'clock in the morning. In the distance, the coasts of the Caucasus rise with snow-clad mountains. We soon reach Baku, the town of petroleum. A noisy crowd of Persians, Tartars, and Armenians throng on the quay. The hubbub of voices was almost deafening. My husband profited by the stoppage of our ship to visit the town. He was shown the famous Black Town, where the naphtha is exported. According to the most recent theory, the substance of naphtha is the produce of the petrification of animals and marine plants. It is not easy to make a fountain of naphtha spout out. Sometimes it is only after 2 years of boring, the layer of ground penetrated being sometimes 20 meters thick. June 1st. The weather has taken a turn for the worse. The sky is overclouded, the wind is rising, and the ship rolls horribly. We have shut ourselves in our cabins. June 2nd. The sun was not yet up when the coasts of Asia appeared on the horizon in long white lines. Towards 7 o'clock in the morning, we entered Krasnovodsk. Flags flutter on the quay, and a triumphal arch is erected with our initials and "Welcome" written in large letters. All the administrative officials of the town have come to present themselves to my husband, who is greeted with the greatest enthusiasm. We come on land and walk between two lines of lookers-on. Prince Tumanov, the chief of the Transcaspian provinces, came up to me with a large bouquet, whilst a military band was playing a march. A special train was waiting on the quay. All the cars are painted white. I have my private car provided with every possible comfort and luxury. At one end is the sitting room containing sofas, armchairs, a large writing table, shelves, etc. The furniture is covered with red silk brocade to match the window curtains. At the other end, a suite consisting of a bedroom with a bed with splendid springs, a bath and dining room. Whilst Sergei was visiting the town, my car was taken to the railway station, a large white building of oriental design and ornamentation. Elegantly dressed ladies and officers in full uniform were waiting my husband on the platform. I leant far back to conceal myself from view, in nervous horror of being stared at. To amuse me, a musical band executed the best pieces of their repertoire, in turns with another band composed of wandering minstrels. An old white-bearded man began to sing in a broken voice a bizarre melody to the accompaniment of a zurna, a national instrument. My heart went out to the poor old troubadour with infinite pity. As soon as my husband arrived, the train steamed away amidst loud cheers. From Krasnovodsk to Tashkend, we have to make 1,800 kilometers by rail. Prince Tumanov and a group of engineers accompany us as far as Samarkand. We have invited the whole company to lunch with us. It was awfully stifling in my car, and I was too hot to talk. I was too exhausted to eat, but devoured with thirst. As soon as lunch was over, I hastened to get into my dressing gown and stretched myself on the sofa. Our road lay for a long time along the Caspian. The moist, warm air that blew through the carriage windows brought a salt taste from the sea. The stretch of country through which we are now passing is flat and uninteresting. Along the roadway, the dust rose in clouds which poured in through the curtains. To crown all, we are devoured by flies. I am furious with the nasty insects, with the heat, with the dust, with everything. At all the stations, the military and civil dignitaries meet my husband. Enthusiastic receptions are made, speeches, music, etc., etc. Crowds of natives welcome us with Eastern greetings of hands to lips and forehead. June 3rd. I didn't close my eyes during the whole night. I turned and turned in my bed, but sleep would not come. The barometer continues to rise. It shows already 32 degrees over zero. Such a tedious journey, and we had a long, long way to go still. I lay motionless on my sofa, hot as a grill, and began to heave sighs hard enough to split a rock. But it did not trouble my traveling companions at all. Quite on the contrary, if I had ceased to moan, they would have come to see what was the matter with me, because they had grown accustomed to my groans and complaints. We enter now the arid steppes of Central Asia. We are in the open desert, desolate and immense. As far as the eye could see on each side, the plain spreads before us, nothing but unlimited sand all round, and great monstrous yellow waves come closing in from all sides, threatening to engulf us. Such a wild, solitary landscape. Anything more dreary is impossible to imagine. There is neither water, tree, nor vegetation of any kind, nothing but glaring sun. It seemed as if we had been transported into a forlorn land. We were the only living things in a dead world. No sign of man or beast. Not even a wandering bird was to be seen. The monotonous click of the engine was the only sound that broke the silence. The stations appear at great intervals in the midst of the desert. Life mustn't be sweet here. As we drew near Kizil Arvat, the landscape changed in character. Verdure begins to appear. We are crossing an oasis. In the distance, we see a caravan of camels advancing slowly. At sundown, we approach Gek Tepe, and our train stops before the tombs of our soldiers killed during the assault of the town, whilst a requiem was chanted for the repose of their souls. Much blood has been spilt here. We passed before the ruins of the fortress made famous by the heroic defense of the natives during a whole month. The walls of the fortress stretch for several kilometers. Towards evening, we arrived at Askabad. In spite of the want of water, the vegetation is luxuriant in these parts. My uncle, General Rohrberg, was the founder of the town. After the conquest of Akal Teki by General Skobelev in 1881, the Grand Duke Michael, commander-in-chief of the Army of the Caucasus, proposed to my uncle, who was at that time general of division, to occupy the post of chief of the Transcaspian provinces. He was ordered to Askabad, which was but a small village inhabited by wandering tribes. My uncle established peace and tranquilized the country, which he began to rule as the Khan, Asiatic despot. In the first place, he had to organize the distribution of ground plots among the natives, the army, and the Russian inhabitants, and plan out the town. A few years ago, my uncle visited Askabad and found it in a flourishing state. It has at present 47,000 inhabitants, exclusive of the nomad population, a tribe bearing the name of Tekensi, and has 2 gymnasiums for boys and girls, 3 municipal schools, and other public establishments. June 4th. The night was so fresh that I had to take out my warm blanket. Early in the morning, we arrived at Merv. Repetition of yesterday's greetings with the offering of bread and salt on a silver dish besides. A few minutes from Merv is Murgab, a beautiful estate belonging to the emperor, extending to the very frontier of Persia. At the station of Amu Darya, a wagon was put at the rear of the train, an observation car. All the back was in glass to view the country. We had to cross the Amu Darya, one of the greatest rivers of the world, on a temporary slender wooden bridge which swung and quivered under us. An iron bridge, about 3 kilometers long, is in construction, a masterpiece of engineering skill, which will cost a large sum to build. I was awfully uneasy whilst we traversed the bridge, and turned to my husband with a frightened face. But Sergei, who had strong nerves, was looking provokingly calm, and laughed at my fears, and nothing was so aggravating as calmness for me at that moment. At the other side of the river we came into a land of beauty and fertility, and rolled through maize and tobacco plantations. I looked around with admiring eyes. Here again was life. The bushes were full of warbling birds. The sun had set when we arrived at Kermene in the domains of the Emir of Bokhara. The railway station is situated at 10 kilometers from the capital of Bokhara, bearing the same name. I was told that the customs in that barbarian country reminded one of prehistoric times. The prison at Kermene consists of 3 deep pits in which swarm pell-mell women, men, and children. On approaching the station, we saw fires lighted in tar barrels, showing 2 battalions of Bokhara soldiers ranged along the railway line. In the semi-darkness, we could have easily taken these men dressed in Russian-cut uniforms for Russian soldiers, especially whilst they shouted in chorus loud hurrahs when my husband appeared at the door of his car. The emir, who was in Moscow at the time, was represented by 3 high dignitaries. A large tent had been erected just opposite the station, in which was prepared an abundant dastarkhan, native dainties of all kinds. The long table, covered with a white tablecloth, reminded one of European customs, but the throng of natives in long khalats and turbans, the bizarre sounds of the native music, and all this oriental mise-en-scène testified that we were very far from Europe, in the center of Mohammedanism, on a visit to an Asiatic sovereign. I was peeping through the blinds of the window and watched the crowd on the platform. I saw the glare of the torches carried by the natives on the faces and the moving forms. The whole Russian colony was assembled on the platform. A deputation of Bokharans came up to present bread and salt to my husband. Before leaving Kermany, Sergei sent a telegram to the emir to thank him for the friendly reception which had been made to him by his representatives. June 5th. The train crosses fresh green valleys. The soil is rich and easy to irrigate. The burning sun gives 2 harvests a year. It is chiefly cotton shrubs which are cultivated here. Turcomen, wearing enormous fur caps, are working in the fields. We see a group of wandering Kirghiz sitting on the ground before their tents. The men of this tribe breed cattle and horses and fabricate a fermented drink made of mare's milk called kumis. We approach Samarkand station. The city of Samarkand is some miles distant. It represents a bushy forest in the middle of which low-roofed houses, towers, and minarets are scattered. It was annexed to Russia in 1868 after the taking of Bokhara. Samarkand has been one of the most famous cities of the Musulman world and had only the town of Pekin as rival in Asia. Its princes were equal to the emperors of China. The glory of Samarkand is departed. Alone and desolate stand the ruins, the remnants of ancient splendor. Samarkand has seen fine old doings. My thoughts wandered back to the time when it had echoed to the tramp of the Greek legions as they thundered forth on their way to India, under the command of Alexander the Great, King of Macedonia, who had rested here during his triumphal march. It is here that the son of the power of Timur, or Tamerlane, the greatest king of the country, who reigned in the 14th century, rose and set. Ruins and sandy plains replace now Tamerlane's beautiful palaces and magnificent gardens. On what does human greatness hang? These ruins of ancient splendor surpass the ruins of Rome and Greece by their magnificence and can be compared only with the ruins of Egypt. Unfortunately, these vestiges of vanished civilization are destroyed, little by little, by frequent earthquakes, and still more by the inhabitants who continue to pull them unmercifully to pieces for their new buildings. In one of the streets of Samarkand, a house was pointed out to my husband whose whole front had been taken from the ruins of one of the most beautiful minarets of the town. On the platform of the railway station, adorned with flags and wreaths of flowers, the governor of Samarkand presented to Sergei a deputation of Sarts, one of the richest tribes of Turkestan. Behind the station, all the soldiers of the garrison of Samarkand, ranged in lines, cheered my husband by loud hurrahs, which produced a great effect upon the natives. I was not in a condition to respond to civilities just now, looking very hot, dusty, and unbrushed, and presented altogether a very disreputable appearance. I would not be seen in such a state, and as it was too late to pay tribute to vanity, I feigned a bad headache in order not to take part at the dinner which had been prepared for us in the staterooms of the stations, transformed into beautifully arrayed saloons. The railway line from Samarkand to Tashkend is not yet inaugurated officially, and the whole way is guarded by patrols to prevent the damage frequently caused to the line by hostile natives. June 6th. We have crossed this night the so-named Starving Plain. This wasteland is well worthy of its denomination. There was nothing but plain, endless plain, always the same dull color. The soil is arid, and the want of water seemed more pronounced as we went on. The Grand Duke Nicholas Konstantinovich, uncle to our emperor, who inhabited Turkestan for more than 17 years, spent the greatest part of his life in this desert, occupying himself with irrigation works in the plain, a part of which he has furrowed with canals. The Grand Duke has spent more than 1,000,000 rubles already for the digging of these canals, which are to transform the barren soil of the starving plain into fertile fields some day. It is a splendid plan, but how is one to get the quantity of water necessary for this purpose? End of section 121. Section 122 of the Diary of a Russian Lady. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Ted Lienhart. The Diary of a Russian Lady by Barbara Doukhovsky. Tashkend. At 10 o'clock in the morning, the train stopped at Tashkend station, where we met a royal reception. A great crowd was on the platform and all around the station. The courtyard was full of carriages and natives curious to see us. I think all the inhabitants were gathered there to stare. We mounted into our carriage, drawn by a pair of splendid long-tailed horses which my husband had bought from the widow of the late Governor-General. 100 Cossacks and a great number of natives on horseback escorted us from the station to our house, called a palace. The horses flew along the streets full of people. Enthusiastic cheers resounded as we passed. We nodded to right and left. Great preparations were made to greet us. The streets were all dressed with flags. The windows and balconies hung with carpets and wreaths of flowers. The photographers made the best of their opportunities and prepared their kodaks for action. We drove fast and soon reached the cathedral, where a Te Deum was sung in our honor. The bishop, in a few hearty words, bade us welcome to Tashkend and pointed out to Sergei that it was the third Asiatic country already which had been confided to him: Erzurum, Khabarovsk, and Tashkend. From the cathedral we walked to the palace. A very large crowd, which was waiting outside the church, followed us. The excitement of the day had utterly exhausted me. I had gone to rest and slept the sleep of the weary and the just when the Grand Duke called upon my husband and asked him to give me a beautiful bouquet of roses, freshly cut by the Grand Duke from the garden of his palace, bound with a sand-colored ribbon, the emblem of the starving plain, which was also welcoming me. On the next day after our arrival, Sergei, surrounded by a brilliant escort of generals and officers, gave audience as representative of His Imperial Majesty Nicholas II to the members of Municipal Council wearing voluminous turbans, who presented to him different deputations. First came a deputation of native notables who delivered to my husband the sum of 4,000 rubles, all in gold, offered by the natives for the benefit of the bereaved families of the soldiers killed during the mutiny in Andijan. They asked Sergei to transmit many expressions of loyalty to the Tsar, as well as their profound indignation on account of the murder of our soldiers. Sergei promised to carry out their wishes, but when the deputies began to comb their beards with their fingers, expressing their satisfaction by sounds reminding one of the howls of wild beasts, my husband, who knew that they were not to be trusted for all their promises and soft speeches, told them by the aid of an interpreter that he would take great care that they should keep their word to the very letter. He said besides that the Tsar had more than 150 million subjects and such numbers of soldiers that, in case of a new rebellion, a whole battalion could easily be quartered in every village of Turkestan. The deputies' faces showed disappointment and fell several degrees. Whence came the representatives of a deputation from the Hindu colony established at Tashkend, fire-worshippers and traders, most of them, bizarre-looking individuals dressed in a sort of long frock coat with black velvet caps on their heads. After the presentation was over, Sergei visited the Mussulman quarters of the town and gave his portrait to some of the most notable natives. One of the imams, who could express himself in Russian pretty well, said to my husband that up to the present the inhabitants of Tashkend celebrated yearly two great feasts, the Ramadan and the Bairam, but henceforth, after Sergei's appearance amongst them, they would celebrate a third one, his visit to them. For flattering words, the Oriental people have not their equal. Our house is furnished with every luxury one can imagine. There is a fine suite of staterooms with beautiful tapestry and pictures. A sitting room is colored mosaic, the ballroom of immense size, with full-length portraits of our imperial family hung on the walls, is capable of accommodating about 300 persons. In the library, long tables are covered with illustrated magazines and papers. The center of the house is topped with a dome of glass. Under it is a large winter garden full of beautiful palms and flourishing plants. In the middle of it, a fountain bubbled up in a basin of white marble. The house is surrounded by extensive grounds with long, shady alleys. It is cool under them, even in the most intense heat. Kiosks, grottos, and rustic bridges are scattered here and there. A waterfall, 3 meters high, rushes into a reservoir just opposite my bedroom windows. The gardens are overloaded with fruit, peaches, grapes, apricots, melons, ripening on every side. In Turkestan, fruit of all kinds abounds. Peaches and apricots are here a common food for pigs. White and black swans swim in the broad Erik Canal, winding like a river in the park. A troop of deer walk about freely on the meadows. They come up and examine us fearlessly. About a dozen foxes live at the end of the park, in a large den formerly occupied by a family of bears. In a big cage walk peacocks who wake me every morning by their piercing shrieks. Our park is a veritable labyrinth. It is surrounded by a wall 20 feet high. Sergei lost himself when he went out riding in the park for the first time. Our numerous household is cosmopolitan. It consists of Sarts, Tartars, Poles, Cossacks, and Germans. At 12 o'clock punctually, when the cannon is fired from the citadel, the head butler, a very solemn personage, comes to announce that luncheon is on the table. He wears a Bulgarian decoration and looks very important with his star. A smart waiter arrayed in a magnific khalat attends behind my husband's chair. The aides-de-camps and functionaries on duty are invited to lunch and dinner every day. The balcony of my bedroom looks out into the park. I used to lounge there for hours in a rocking chair after dinner. The steps of the sentinel, walking to and fro with his gun on his shoulder, were sharply audible. I did not move. I was so cozy here, listening to the monotonous splash of the fountain and the gentle rustling of the wind amongst the branches of the trees. The light breeze brought me the perfume of flowers. From the garden came the scent of heliotropes from a bed beneath the balcony. My thoughts flew away, far, very far, to darling St. Petersburg. For 2 days the rain never ceased pouring. There are mud pools of water everywhere. When the sun had sufficiently dried the streets, we went for a drive through the town, escorted by a platoon of Cossacks. We drove through wide, tree-shaded streets. The flat-topped houses, generally not more than a story high, are covered with verdure. It is dangerous to build high edifices in the country because of the frequent earthquakes. We were in the hottest part of the day and saw but few people in the streets. From noon to 4 o'clock, the inhabitants of Tashkend take their siesta. When the heat decreases, the native quarters begin to fill with life and local color. We drove along arcaded streets like narrow corridors towards the bazaar, passing by numerous chai khans, tea houses, and were saluted on our passage by profound salams. The natives passed their hands over their faces and beards, a gesture which signifies that their sentiments towards us are as clear as a well-washed face. Steady-handed barbers are shaving customers on the threshold of their shops. Vociferating sellers sit on low tables behind piles of fruit and vegetables. Imperturbable and passive Sarts, sitting cross-legged on rugs, smoke their kalyans and appear to be plunged in profound meditation. Here is a group of Duvanas, Mecca pilgrims, wearing sharp-pointed caps. They are listening to a Madha, street storyteller. The Sart women leave their houses hidden beneath their faranja, a dark mantle which covers them from head to foot and makes them look like guys. They follow more strictly than any other daughters of the Orient the principles of the Musulman religion and cover their faces with black horsehair nets. I have seen veiled Turkish women at Constantinople, but in such a transparent manner that they differed but little from our European ladies wearing slight veils over their hats. At Cairo, the veils are thicker, but for that, the Egyptian women leave their eyes uncovered. The Musalman women in India go out in the streets unveiled, just the same as our Kyrgyz women. The natives are very fond of music. In every tent of the nomad tribes, in every khul house, one can see a two-stringed instrument called dutara, a sort of guitar. The Sart makes even of his arba, a massive cart, an instrument of barbaric music, putting a stick into the wheels, so that the stick catching the spokes reproduces the sound of the drum, which resounds through the streets of Tashkend to the accompaniment of the monotonous singing of the proprietor of the arba, a wailing, winding chant, which, as it had no end, may well have had no beginning. The Sart sings always in a high-pitched voice, for to sing in a basso voice is considered unbecoming. The arba is put upon two enormous wooden wheels and driven by one horse, on whose back sits astride the carter, his legs stretched on the shafts. The Sarts never grease their arbas, and the noise produced by these screeching wheels compose a terrible discord, accompanied by the piercing cry of the camels and the howling of vagrant dogs. The Sarts are perfectly indifferent to the change of temperature. Neither heat nor cold affects them in any way. They have no stoves in their houses. A hole in the floor is the family cooking place, and an opening is broken through the roof for the emission of smoke. The streets are watered several times a day, which lays the dust but contributes also to increase pernicious fevers. The climate is very unwholesome in Turkestan. Immediately after sunset, it becomes so damp that it is dangerous to remain out of doors. In June, the heat is intolerable. I held a reception once a week. Between 2 and 5, about 100 persons would pass through our saloons. The day I held my first reception, the large drawing room was crowded with guests. I had to take up the subject of politics and be amiable to everyone. I was so tired with having had to talk all the time that my tongue, having refused to obey me, I said good-bye instead of good afternoon to a belated visitor. The Grand Duke was amongst our guests and gained my sympathy at once. He is not a bit haughty and altogether charming, and I felt perfectly at ease with him. He is such a nice-looking man, towering nearly a head over everyone. When taking leave, the Duke asked me to come and drink a cup of chocolate the next day. He was awfully amiable to me and took me all over his palace, a veritable museum. Amongst other curiosities, he showed me a watch made by Brize, which goes without being wound up. It is put into the pocket, and after you have taken a few steps, the watch is already set going for 24 hours. There exists only 2 examples of such watches. Brize valued them at 10,000 francs each. Alexander II possessed the first one. Being free from all household management, I feel myself on a visit here. The first days of my arrival, I did not know how to while away the time, wishing for even the mildest adventure, something that would put a little spice into the insipidity of our lives. I would like a row now and then, just to enliven things a little. For distraction, I tried to pick a quarrel with Sergei, making tragedies of pure nonsense, but it takes 2 to make a quarrel, and Sergei is a man of peace and is a desperately calm person, and finds it necessary for the sake of domestic quiet to put up with all my tempers. Nothing could put him out of patience. Every day I grew more and more homesick. I often was in tears, not taking interest in anything. The awful climate was injurious to my health. I have no appetite, no sleep. The pink has gone out of my cheeks. Someone had cast an evil eye upon me, to be sure. I've got so thin and pale that I am afraid to look at myself in the glass. Sergei, who reads my face, which is a mirror of all passive emotions, like a familiar book, grew alarmed and called in a doctor, but no doctor's prescriptions were any good for my complaint. Mephistopheles whispered into my ear that instead of making me swallow horrid mixtures, the best remedy for me would be to fly back to Petersburg, but I have decided not to let myself be tempted by the enemy of mankind. At the end of a month, I began to feel myself at home. I work hard at my book and give much time to my English concertina. This melodious instrument leads to the transmission of the most difficult violin literature. I am passionately fond of music, having inherited that passion from my father, who had the true artistic temperament and was a gifted musician and a splendid pianist. The life that I had to lead was entirely out of my line. I hate state receptions, state manners, grandeurs weigh heavily upon me, and etiquette to the laws of which I must submit. I have got a court like a little queen. Everyone is charming to me, but I, ungrateful being, should have liked warm friendship far better than respectful homage. I had hundreds of acquaintances and not a single intimate friend, and I was badly in need of one. I hated my reception days when callers flocked in on us and I had to talk to people only for the sake of talking, pretending to be pleased when all the time I want to say, "Oh, do go away." One of the disadvantages of being the wife of a governor-general was the necessity of suffering bores gladly. As soon as the clock struck 6 and the last guest had departed, I hastened to step down from my pedestal and put on with delight my dressing gown and stretch myself in an easy chair. How I longed to get away from all these ties of public life, to stay at St. Petersburg and live the life of a simple mortal, independent and apart from the so-called world, and be free of all pomp. But there is no use my thinking about it. It's silly to want the moon. I am selected for president of the Benevolent Society of the city of Tashkend. The meetings of the committee are held in our house. I presided at a long table covered with green cloth. At the first assembly, I felt timid and embarrassed, for many eyes were on me, and for the moment I almost forgot how to get on with the formal little speech I had learned so carefully. I was grateful when Sergei, who sat opposite to me, came to my relief and did all the talking for me. All at once my courage returned to me, and I took an animated part in the project to found an asylum for old men and women. It was decided to organize for that purpose a great charity feast with theatricals, bazaar, tombola, and whatnot. I issued about 700 invitations, with an indirect allusion to the subject of offerings which I claimed for the forthcoming lottery. The opening of the new asylum was celebrated with great pomp. The directress of the establishment hurried forward to meet us and led us straight to the chapel where a Te Deum was sung, after which we were shown through the asylum, containing 600 old people of both sexes. It gave also shelter to an officer's daughter who was not quite right in her mind. Her bridegroom had been mixed up in some political affair and sent to the galleys, and she had gone mad from the shock. The poor, insane woman is barely 30 years old, but looks 50 at least, arrayed in a costume which our grandmothers wore in their youth. She leads a very secluded life and never speaks to anyone. We saw her walking in the garden, her eyes fixed on the ground, pretending not to see us. On that same day, we visited an asylum for the lunatics. The whole staff of doctors came up to meet us. We walked first to the women's section. The patients were wandering in the park in groups. One of them came up to my husband to entreat him to release her, asserting that she was in perfect health, but would certainly go raving mad if she was forced to spend one more night in such company. That woman had come a few days ago to ask Sergei to permit her to embrace the Mussulman religion. She told him also that in hatred of one of the high dignitaries of the city, she had written to him that she cursed him and all his family. It appeared she bought a revolver with the intention of shooting him. She was seized in time, luckily, and brought into this lunatic asylum to test her sanity. Another insane creature, grinning idiotically, approached me and stared at me from head to foot. She became very fierce all at once and began to abuse me, calling me all sorts of bad names, and accused me of having stolen her best frock. When we approached the section of the raving lunatics, roars and shouts reached our ears. Though trembling with fear, I would not be led away and kept tight hold of Sergei's arm, clinging fast to him. Behind an iron-barred window, we saw a horrible mustached creature, standing with her arms folded across her chest, glaring ferociously at us with an expression so malignant that Satan would have been jealous of her. She believes herself to be a man and becomes terribly agitated when she sees a woman. She beckoned to me suddenly, making dreadful gestures and demoniac grimaces. Sergei hurried me away. We made but a short visit to the men's section. We saw a man mad with love for the Empress. The poor maniac writes long letters every day to his lady-love, but receiving no answer, he guesses that everybody plays him false and that his letters are not sent. He was lying on his bed when we approached him and turned suddenly his face to the wall and his back to us. I heaved a sigh of relief when we left these sad quarters. In July, great festivals were arranged to celebrate the 23rd anniversary of the taking of Tashkend. There was a parade of troops on the square before the palace, after which my husband proceeded to the tomb of our soldiers killed during the siege of the town and laid a wreath on their grave. We gave a grand dinner that same day for about 100 guests. An amusing incident occurred during this meal. Among the guests, there were some important natives who had come from the end of the country. One of these men, who had never tasted European cooking, took a pot of mustard for a separate dish and swallowed a whole spoonful of it. He naturally gasped, choked, whilst tears ran in rivulets down his cheeks. His neighbor at table, who had not noticed the proceeding with the mustard, asked him the cause of his grief. The native, heaving a deep sigh, answered that he had just called to mind his deceased father, and that today was the anniversary of his death. He had been drowned in the Amu Darya whilst sailing on the river in a small boat. Meanwhile, his left-hand neighbor, a compatriot of his, had followed his example, having also regaled himself with mustard, and with the same consequences, of course. The son of the drowned man was wickedly rejoiced at his blunder, and asked in his most velvety tone, "Why does my brother cry?" "Because I regret that thou didst not disappear beyond the mysterious regions of the Amu Darya together with thy father," was the cunning reply. Everybody laughed when the interpreter translated this dialogue between the two natives. Our life had many dark moments. There had been a great excitement these last few days. Bad news had arrived. A new rebellion was apprehended. We stood on a volcano that might explode at any moment. The only thing to ask ourselves was, when will it begin to pour out its flames? Anonymous letters, splashed with blood, announced to my husband that on the night of the 30th July, a holy war would break out. What troublesome times we are living through. One side of our park is joined to the native quarters of the town, and a little shiver ran down my back each time the clear voice of the muezzin chanted from the minaret of the neighboring mosque, calling the faithful to prayer. Allah Allah, there is no God but God. Though things had looked serious for some time, they seemed to have quieted down again. Thanks to energetic means, the agitation in the country was soon calmed down. When autumn arrived, I started for St. Petersburg. It was arranged that my husband was to rejoin me in a few weeks' time, and that we should return together to Tashkend in the spring. I hated to part from Sergei. I shall want him horribly, but I must see to the publishing of the first part of my book and end the last part. Absolute quiet is essential for rapid work. Our separation would not be a very prolonged one, and Sergei was to write every day. August 9th. My husband had to go on business to Bokhara and Andijan, the place of the recently appeased mutiny. I will profit by it by making a part of the journey with him. We started today at 10 o'clock in the morning. The station was quite full. All the military and civil authorities of the town and all the members of the committee of the Benevolence Society came to wish me a happy journey and safe return. I had to shake hands with such a lot of people that my glove burst in several places, and I received such a lot of bouquets that they were hard to hold. The supply of beautiful flowers in my car made it look like a flower shop. August 11th. This morning I had to part with Sergei, and we went each our several ways. My car was coupled to the express, and when the time for parting with my husband came, I cried so awfully that I had to borrow Sergei's pocket handkerchief. It was a very painful moment, and I found it hard to tear myself away. It seemed as if we could never finish saying goodbye. The guide gave the signal, and the train moved off. Soon Sergei's face was out of sight. and I was left to my thoughts and to my loneliness. The knowledge that the train was bearing me further and further from Sergei, and that every moment was increasing the distance between us, made me wild. I threw myself back in the corner of the carriage and had a good cry. I am well taken care of. Sergei had given me into the charge of one of his aides-de-camps who was going to Krasnovodsk and asked him to take me to the steamer. August 12th. The same scenery is repeated with fatiguing uniformity. The desolate, sun-baked desert spread out, and the yellow steppes joined with the horizon. The journey seems to last ages. August 13th. The heat is not so intense today. The sky is gray, and big drops of rain begin to fall. At 8 o'clock in the morning, we arrived at Krasnovodsk, where I was received by the agent of the steamboat company, an old admiral retired from the service. The Tropic, a boat built in England, was reserved for my crossing. I have the best cabin. A placard placed over the door bears the following inscription in English: to accommodate 4 seamen, but one could easily place a dozen of men in it. It proves to what an extent the English consider the comfort of their sailors. I went to my lonely bed in rather a depressed frame of mind. Sleep would not come. I was seized with an ungovernable longing to see Sergei, to hear his voice, and my mind was filled with only one thought: I must go back. It was too late to turn back now. The captain came at the door to wish me good night, but it was rather a mockery under the circumstances, for I never closed my eyes, thanks to my blue devils and the horrid rolling of the boat. August 14th. We had very rough weather in the night and were dancing all the time on formidable waves. Our boat was creaking in every joint. I heard the sailors running on the upper deck and the watch officer shouting orders in a voice of thunder. What did all this uproar mean? In a terrible fright, I jumped out of bed and, dressing speedily, hurried on deck. It was our boat changing its course and going out into the open sea instead of following the shore to avoid the breakers. The captain came to tell me that I had nothing to be afraid of and could go to sleep in security. He promised for tomorrow a sea as calm as a lake. The captain is awfully nice to me and performs an endless series of little attentions looking to my comfort. He has, as it appears, the intention to fatten me up like the cattle destined for the slaughterhouse, but seasickness takes away all my appetite. August 15th. The distant coasts of the Caucasus appear like a gray outline. Towards 10 o'clock in the morning, the Tropic landed us at Petrovsk 5 hours behind time. The captain insisted upon my passage being free, which cost me a great deal more in tips for the crew. He accompanied me with his officers to the railway station. End of section 122. Section 123 of the Diary of a Russian Lady. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Ted Lienhart. The Diary of a Russian Lady by Barbara Doukhovsky. St. Petersburg. August 18th. It was pouring with rain this morning when we arrived at St. Petersburg. My mother was at the station to meet me and took me to the new house my husband had bought in one of the most fashionable quarters of the city. I had a letter 4 pages long from Sergei, full of interesting detail about his interview with the emir at Kermene and of his journey to Andijan, where the recent mutiny had taken place. A crowd of prostrated figures, their faces against the ground, were awaiting his arrival. After a Te Deum sung on a square before the cathedral, my husband distributed to the wounded soldiers a whole lot of crosses of the Order of St. George, whilst cannons were fired. From Andijan, Sergei traveled on to Aish, a town situated near the frontier of the Pamir, in a mountainous region named the Roof of the World. An old Kyrgyz woman called the Queen of the Alai, aged 87, came up to my husband, supported by her 2 sons, white-bearded old men. This Asiatic princess reminded one of the antique Mother of the Grashi, A few days after his return to Tashkend, Sergei received the visit of the heir to the throne of Khiva. I saw no visitors and went nowhere, working hard at my book till late in the night, keeping awake with black coffee. At the end of the week, I found solitude intolerable and began to feel awfully dull. Every day was the same. The hours seemed years. It was so hard to be alone here. I had seldom experienced much of my own society and was sick of my own company. Sergei being absent, the world seemed one great blank. I never had him out of my thoughts for 1 minute. Sometimes I had the impulse to take the first train and fly back to Tashkend. October had passed, and Sergei did not come. I bombarded him with desperate letters full of exclamation points, always putting the stereotyped question when he would arrive. I read in the papers that the plague had broken out near Samarkand, carrying away every day a great many victims, and that the Prince of Oldenburg was going there with a medical expedition. I was getting awfully anxious about Sergei and felt tempted to throw up everything and rush back to him. I had the most awful dreams and imagined all sorts of calamities and spoiled my eyes with tears, having only one thought, to rejoin my husband. I could endure my suspense no longer and telegraphed to Sergei, imploring him to let me come to Tashkend. I waited with feverish impatience for his permission to start instantly, but my husband, who never refused me in trifles, did not give in when it concerned serious matters. He would not hear of this. He firmly opposed my arrival and wired to me to be reasonable and have patience. But patience, alas, was contrary to my temperament. My 101 wishes were always fulfilled until now, and when it has come to the 102nd wish, stop? Oh, on. Sergei's opposition made me only the more obstinately determined to have my own way. I dispatched him a long letter, an ultimatum in fact. I wrote that if he did not arrive at St. Petersburg in the course of a fortnight, I should start to Tashkend without awaiting his permission. I worried Sergei till I finally got him to consent to my going over to rejoin him. My maid brought me a telegram from my husband with my tea one morning. I opened it and read one word, come. I wanted to leave at once in spite of mother and some friends who tried to make me understand the danger I was running in going to meet the plague. But I am a fatalist and fear nothing. All their persuasions fell on stony ground. If they think that they will stop me, they are very much mistaken. No consideration of wisdom will ever induce me not to do what I want to do. I would not hear reason and was in a hurry to go back to Tashkend. With me to think has always been to act. The sooner I start, the better. October 17th. I am off to Tashkend today with Maria Mikhailovna and my maid Mina. All the cars of our train are occupied by the members of the medical expedition sent to Tashkend to fight against the plague. It consists of 40 doctors and 10 sisters of mercy. The rain is coming down in torrents, but when I felt happy, I was not in the least aware that the sun was not shining, and I am so happy now to rejoin Sergei. Our train is an express and rushes past nearly all the stations. We hadn't time for dinner and snatched a sandwich at a railway buffet that had probably been waiting more than a week for travelers to arrive. October 21st. We were at Petrovsk at 10 o'clock in the morning. I saw the Tsarevich, a great ship ready for sea, with steam up, making ready to cast off and be gone. The gangway was just about to be withdrawn when we got on board. I am again on the hateful element. The sea is covered with foam. The wind blows impetuously, rising in enormous billows. We have to struggle both with the hurricane and the swift current, which does not permit us to approach the coasts of Darbent, where we had to put in. I suffer a great deal from seasickness, although I have made 3 voyages round the world. All the passengers look green and miserable. October 22nd. At 11 o'clock we arrived at Baku, where a very disagreeable surprise awaited us. We have to leave the boat and go over to the Prince Baryatinsky, a poor little thing, little more than a yacht. The Tsarevich is retained for the Prince of Oldenburg. We made ourselves as comfortable as we could in our stuffy little cabin. Towards evening we entered a dense fog and could not see 4 paces ahead. The captain does not leave the poop, and every 5 minutes the foghorn throws piercing shrieks into the black night. October 23rd. At daybreak, the fog cleared away. The sea is quite smooth. We are going full speed, making 15 knots an hour. At 10 o'clock, we entered the port of Krasnovodsk. My car was attached to the express of the Prince of Oldenburg, who arrived in the afternoon on the Tsarevich. Before starting, the prince sent his aide-de-camp to ask if I could receive him. I replied that I felt very tired for the moment, but hoped that I should be able to see His Highness during our long railway journey. October 25th. I found a telegram from Sergei waiting for me at Kermine, telling me by what train he would meet me at the station for Kata-Kurgan. I am happy, happy, happy. We had a long time to wait at Kermine because the Emir had come to see the Prince of Oldenburg, and our train was not due to start for 2 mortal hours. I must just have patience and wait, but as patience is an unknown word in my vocabulary, I grumbled awfully at the delay. This time I traveled incognito and was left in peace. My blinds were scrupulously drawn down. Trying to shorten the hours that separated me from my husband, I went to bed directly after dinner. Oh, I wish it was tomorrow. October 26th. It was only in the middle of the night that we arrived at Kata-Kurgan, where Sergei's wagon was joined to our train. I can't find words to express my joy. It was about 11 o'clock when we stopped at the station of Samarkand. Everywhere was the smell of pungent disinfectant. We are going to remain 2 days here. Sergei put up at the house of General Fedorov, governor of Samarkand. The town is 10 miles from the station, but I prefer to remain in my car, standing alone in a sidetrack of the line. The road leading to the station was illuminated at night with different colored lanterns hanging from the trees. October 27th. The chief of the station, who took care of my sleep and was afraid that I should be aroused by the shrieks of the maneuvering engines, gave order to the engine drivers to moderate their transports when blowing their whistles. The medical expedition has arrived this morning. 4 lady physicians, accompanied by 12 Sisters of Mercy, called upon me in the afternoon. They told me that a part of the expedition had been sent to Anzob, a pestilence-stricken village, and got there with great difficulty. There was no carriage road, and they had to make their way by precipitous paths in the mountains. My husband proposed to the medical expedition to organize an ocular ambulatory inspection during their stay at Samarkand, which was especially necessary in this country, where eye diseases predominate, thanks to the rare and superficial connection of the natives with water. Their famous religious ablutions consist in the submersion of their hands in a vase filled with water of doubtful cleanliness, in which they wash away their sins, and after that they dash the water over their faces, and it happens sometimes that a whole crowd of natives have already performed their ablutions in that basin of water. One can easily imagine the hygiene of this ceremony. October 28th. This morning, a group of Asiatic princes were presented to my husband in his railway car. Amongst them, there was the pretender to the throne of Afghanistan, Isaac Khan, leading his little son by the hand. Before that prince, several pretenders to the throne of Afghanistan had chosen Samarkand for their residence. Amongst them, the famous Abdurrahman, who, after having been raised to the throne, had shown his gratitude to the friendliness of the Russians by playing false. Under pain of death, the entrance of Russian subjects into his territory was forbidden. Isaac Khan is poor as a rat. He is living on a petty allowance of the Russian government, and though he has very little hope of succeeding to the throne of Afghanistan, he brings up his son as if the throne would belong to him one day or other. When the boy is asked who he is, he answers with an air of great importance, "I am Grand Sirdar, General-in-Chief," but for the moment his army consists only of half a dozen ragged servants. I took an instinctive dislike to his father, and saw Borgia written all over him. In fact, I believe the prince a man capable of anything, and though honeyed words come readily to his lips, his eyes flash an evil look, and hardly ever meet those of the person with whom he talks. There was something in his appearance which distinctly alarmed me. He would have made a perfect villain in a melodrama, with a beard growing almost reaching his eyes. It was not a face that one would care to meet when alone in the dark. Amongst the exotic princes I saw the suzerain of a small principality, who, after having become a Russian subject, received as recompense the grade of major. He wears a khalat with Russian epaulets, girded with a green sash, a sign that he is a descendant of the Prophet. When the presentations ended, my husband distributed medals and khalats to the native notables who came up to him preparing their most engaging smiles. After having received their gift, they retired backwards, murmuring profuse thanks and touching their forehead, mouth, and heart, contriving to stimulate on their faces sentiments of profound gratitude, though nourishing a profound hatred towards the Russians. From these treacherous people one can expect anything. It is an eternal armed peace with them. October 30th. At 10 o'clock precisely, we arrived at Tashkend station. My unexpected arrival was welcomed with joy and cordiality. I distributed my nods and smiles on each hand. The back of my neck was sore with bowing. Energetic measures are being taken to check the progress of the epidemic. The plague is daily decreasing, and the Emperor charged the Prince of Oldenburg to thank my husband for the energetic measures he had taken to battle with it. The first leaves begin to fall, and the park looks very dismal. The weather is horrible, the sky leaden gray. I hear the monotonous wail of the wind and the rain beating against the window panes. This time my stay at Tashkend was but a very short one. At the end of a fortnight, I was on my way back to St. Petersburg. November 12th. When I arrived at Samarkand, a telegram from the Emir was brought to me. The Asiatic sovereign asked to be warned in advance so that I could be received with fitting ceremony at Kermene, where he wanted to meet me. But I refused and begged him by wire not to trouble himself, because we passed Kermene by night. November 14th. The Amu Darya is very low at this season. The big river in several places forms wide sandbanks, and this time I was not a bit afraid to cross the bridge. November 16th. We arrived this morning at Krasnovodsk, where I took my passage on the Kornilov. The weather is bright and clear. The sea is shining in the sun, promising a favorable crossing. November 17th. The wind has changed during the night, bringing bad weather. After dinner, the captain came to ask how I was and told me that the lights of Petrovsk had been sighted and that another half hour will find us on shore. We had 4 hours to wait before the train started. November 21st. I arrived safe and sound at St. Petersburg, having had quite enough of railway and sea. Our capital was very animated this season. Soirees, dinners, concerts, the whirl went on, but I shut myself within 4 walls and scarcely saw anyone. I can't enjoy anything when Sergei is not there. I am reckoned as being eccentric and leading the life of a nun in her cell, a very spacious one, it is true, but I have a sublime indifference to public opinion, having my own way of looking at things, and am not, as a rule, meddling with other people's business. Why do they meddle with mine? I am free of my own actions and can do as I like, I suppose. Goethe says, "The happiest of mortals is he who finds his happiness in his own home." I can, therefore, be placed among the happy ones. It is music which is my passion. In my spare moments I had some lessons on the guitar, but I soon put an end to them, the chords of the instrument hurting my fingers. Then I bought a cithern, the chords of which hurt me still more, and resolved to give myself up, as before, to the concertina. At last I decided to come out of my shell and went sometimes to theaters and concerts. Volodya Rugitsky, a gifted boy pianist of 13, enchanted me by his performance of the works of Chopin, Liszt, and Rubinstein. I wonder if this Wunderkind will ever become a Wundermann. Antonin Konsky came to St. Petersburg to give a concert. He had a tremendous success. The audience was enthusiastic and the applause was deafening. I enjoyed his concert a great deal and applauded so much that I split my gloves. For the last encore, the audience demanded Le Reveil du Lion, one of Konsky's masterpieces. Then the old maestro returned and bowed to the wildly excited people and said, "My lion is weary. He is going to bed, but next week I'll bring out my wild animal if you still desire to hear his roaring." My husband is promoted to the rank of general-in-chief. He was brigadier general when I married him, and it is now the third and last rank that I enjoy with him. In the middle of December, Sergei sent me a telegram to say that he had taken a 6 months' leave. We decided to spend Christmas in Merchik, the beautiful estate belonging to my husband's elder brother, situated in the government of Kharkov. I started from Merchik to meet Sergei in the highest of spirits. A week later, we were both back to St. Petersburg. When spring came on, I began to learn to ride the bicycle. After some inevitable tumbles, I soon surmounted the difficulties of this sport. May 17th. The day of our departure for Tashkend is come. This time we decided to stream down the Volga from Nizhny Novgorod to Astrakhan. When we arrived at Nizhny Novgorod, we went straight to the boat. Numerous porters with heavy loads on their backs invaded the deck. They are able to bear extraordinary burdens. We saw a man carrying a piano coming up a narrow plank onto our steamer just as easily as a world-famed athlete would have performed it. Our boat has weighed anchor. The weather is beautiful. After dinner, we lay stretched on our rocking chairs on deck, inhaling with delight the fresh evening breeze. Seagulls followed us. An obliging sailor, a good-looking, sun-tanned young fellow, brought me big lumps of black bread to feed them. We ply between two low and flat banks, only reeds round about and fishing men's huts here and there. I must say, though, it is not very patriotic of me that the Volga is not to be compared to the romantic Rhine, which, in its turn, is not to be compared to the lovely shores of the Amur, one of the most beautiful rivers in the world. During our numerous voyages, we had seen the Mississippi, the Yangtze Kiang, the river of St. Lawrence, and many other big rivers, and I find that the Amur surpasses them all by the beauty of its banks. May 18th. This morning we arrived at Kazan. Large barges come up to unload our cargo of coal. We remained here till 6 o'clock, and Sergei went to see the governor of the city, having to discuss different questions concerning the Mussulmans who compose the 9th part of the population of Russia. The principal center of their domicile is the Caucasus, Crimea, Turkestan, and the government of Kazan. At first sight, it seems that the Mussulmans of Turkestan and those of Kazan differ widely in conditions and characteristics. They have different histories, and last but not least, quite different modes of life. But in reality, it is not so. The dream of the splendor and glory of their prophet unites them all. That refers not only to the Mussulmans inhabiting Russia, but just as much to the millions of believers peopling India, Turkey, and other Muslim countries. The task of administering equal justice to Muslims and Christians is a difficult one. The Mussulmans are all clever diplomatists from their youth. Talleyrand said that the tongue was given to the man to hide his thoughts, and the Mussulmans, who have understood it long before him, profit largely by this principle. I was present at an interesting interview which took place between my husband and some Buryat syndics during our travel through the Transbaikalia provinces. They were Buddhists, all of them. The interview took place soon after the nomad Buryats were placed on a level with the Russian population, perhaps not quite to the satisfaction of the Buryats. When Sergei asked them if they were satisfied with the change of their social position, the syndics replied frankly that they were but tolerably pleased. With these people one could come to an understanding somehow, but it is quite different with the Mussulmans. This is a discourse that my husband held with a group of Muslim syndics who were presented to him in one of his voyages in the provinces of Turkestan, all standing with sweeping salams from floor to forehead, their turbaned heads bent low. Sergei's words were translated into their native tongue by an interpreter. Do you remember the everlasting wars you had in the time when you were under the dominion of your Khans, when nobody knew that, leading a peaceful and easygoing life today, your blood would not be shed tomorrow? Do you not feel happier now when the laborer can gather in his harvest quietly and the merchant sell his wares in safety? And all the syndics, smoothing their long white beards, replied in chorus, Hosh, taksir, it is true, master. Do you remember that not long ago spears were driven into you, and that you were condemned to death without any judgment? Are you punished now without any plausible cause? Hosh, taksir, asserted the syndics, bowing very low. Did your administrators ever build schools, hospitals, nicely paved roadways? Did they give you an impartial court of justice and incorruptible functionaries? At these last words, a swift change swept over their faces. With a malicious smile, they exchanged a look, and their countenances again remained expressionless, as if carved in wood, and the same stereotype answer was heard, Hosh taksir, and only accidentally you could learn from the junior natives that their elders remembered with veneration the time when they were not sure of the following day and when they were pierced through with spears. They weren't in want of any innovation either, provided that their crescent should be glorified everywhere. In such conditions, when the population does not come to meet the enterprises of the administration, all the measures concerning the Mussulmans scattered about Russia must be taken by the administrators. It is precisely on this subject that my husband had conferred with the governor of Kazan, whilst I pined alone in my stuffy cabin. As soon as Sergei returned on board, we continued our way. The smell of naphtha pursues us. The surface of the water is covered with large spots of naphtha, all the colors of the rainbow. It is pretty to look at, but this substance is injurious to the fish, the best species of which have disappeared from the Volga. The night is splendid, the sky is all studded with stars, and I have no wish to go to bed. May 20th. The weather has changed, and the Volga is stirred into little rippling waves by the passing of the wind. We are at Samarkand in the afternoon. A large company of young ladies, pupils of the Institute of Orenburg and scholars of the Corps of Cadets, came on board our steamer. They are bound for Turkestan to spend their summer holidays. An elderly grandmother of one of the cadets had charge of the young people. The officers and functionaries serving in Tashkend have the right to send their children to be educated in Orenburg on the government's account. From Samara to Saratov, the Volga is more like a lake than a river. We pass under an immense iron bridge, the building of which cost 7 million rubles. I remained all the time on deck, admiring the beautiful banks along which rise forest-clothed hills. Towards 4 o'clock in the afternoon, we arrived at Saratov. A company of Cossacks took passage on our boat. The men came from Orenburg and are going to serve their time in Turkestan for 3 years. After dinner, the Cossacks sang in chorus and danced wild jigs on the deck, whilst, on the other hand, a man with a green turban, which indicated that he was a Mecca pilgrim, went through the necessary forms of prayer on the rug at his feet, with his face to the east, first standing, then kneeling, then prostrating himself. May 21st. The banks of the Volga are low and sandy in these parts. The sky has become gray. The water has taken a dull color, and the rain is beginning to fall heavily. In the afternoon, we arrived at Astrakhan and were immediately surrounded by a noisy crowd of Kalmucks, Tartars, and Persians. We had a jolly dinner on deck. My husband's aides-de-camp and attachés were so amusing and merry. They ordered champagne and drank my health. Mr. Baumgarten, one of the attachés, the soul of the company, when raising his glass to me, made a most charming speech. He said that my presence embellished their journey, and that they regretted awfully that our arrival at Tashkend would put an end to the pleasure of having a good deal of my company, for we only met at meals. Dinner over, we had music in the saloon. After my solo on the concertina, Mr. Baumgarten, who had been inspired by my performance and was by nature somewhat of a poet, improvised a piece of poetry of the most tender nature, with the following dedication: to Mrs. Barbara Doukhovsky, in remembrance of a never-to-be-forgotten night on the Volga. It is spoken there of love, moon, and the rest. The poetry ended with the words, Oh, enchanting night on the Volga, can I ever forget thee? How sweetly poetical! Who could have believed fat Mr. Baumgarten to be so gifted? May 22nd. The Volga is so broad that the shores disappear. Only a narrow yellow line of bank is to be seen. At dawn, we changed our steamer for a larger one, the Equator. We had to part from the Volga here. Our boat stole out towards the open sea. The neighborhood of Astrakhan plays a great part in the life of the Trans-Caspian provinces. All sorts of wares and products are imported there in great quantity. This time our steamer is loaded with barrels of beer. The wind raises great waves, which sweep our deck. We shall have a good tossing about on the treacherous Caspian Sea, no doubt. May 23rd. I have slept very badly the whole night because of the intense heat and the horrid rolling of the ship. Every hour I heard the change of watch ringing. At last I saw the morning twilight entering by the porthole. A brown-colored lamb, brought by our sailors from Persia, squeezed himself through the half-open door of my cabin. He was on friendly terms with my little pug-nosed Chinese dog, Moko, and both animals began to chase each other, making an awful noise. May 24th. Horrible night. A heavy gale blowing all the time. The sailors couldn't hear the words of command. We rolled unmercifully. We arrived in the morning at Krasnovodsk and walked to the train which was waiting for us near the pier. During the short walk I had to fight against the wind, which did its utmost to carry off my hat and blew my umbrella into a sail. Before starting we were shown the railway carriage which had just been presented to the Emir by our emperor. It impressed me by its splendor. This carriage, painted blue and ornamented with golden stars, will be very useful to the Emir when the Orenburg railway line is terminated, for he goes for a cure to the Caucasus every year. May 25th. What a heat! The roof of my car is covered with a thick layer of earth to protect it from the rays of the burning sun, but it is of no use. We are roasted alive all the same. This morning we nearly ran over a camel. The encounter with these quadrupeds is very disagreeable, for it is only by repeated loud whistles that our engine driver can make them leave the rails. They kept running before the train all the time. May 26th. It is Sunday today. When we approached the station of Merv, church bells began to toll. It was a church car which was waiting to be hooked onto our train, and thus we had Mass whilst crossing the vast desert. May 27th. At 7 o'clock in the morning we were at Carmine, where the Emir had come to welcome us. Opposite the platform was erected a large tent in which a copious lunch was prepared. But I did not leave my car, feigning a bad headache. A band of native musicians came to divert me with their weird music, which made me grind my teeth. A beautiful bouquet was brought to me from the Emir, together with a rich casket containing a pair of earrings with diamonds as large as hazelnuts. The Emir invited my husband and his suite to dine at his summer residence, 8 miles from the station. In their absence, the soldiers of the Bacarian watchguard were lying stretched out full length in the shade under the trees, indulging in a dolce far niente. My husband returned late in the night, and we continued on our way. To Sergei, the palace of the Emir proved a disappointment. It is an ugly building of no particular kind of architecture. The apartments are decorated with pictures, statues, and ornaments of every sort, stuck up anyhow and everywhere. The Emir regaled my husband with a luciless repast, with champagne in profusion, but the Emir drank only lemonade, fermented drinks being forbidden by the Koran. May 28th. At last we are nearing Tashkend. Towards noon our train stopped at the railway station, full of people. After having gone through the proceedings of hasty greetings with all present, we went to our carriage. On our passage, native musicians blew with all their might into pipes of enormous length, raising them to the skies. They performed such beastly sounds that I feared our horses would take fright and bolt. A few days after our arrival, 3 foreign tourists paid an unexpected visit to Tashkend. Sven Hayden, the renowned Swedish Pamir and Tibet explorer, who had written a book about these countries, McSweeney, an English colonel going out to India to command a Bengal regiment, and Mr. Herbert Powell, an English traveler going to try the shortest way leading from London to India, the future railway line. For the present, the English make this journey via Brindisi and the Suez Canal in 3 weeks' time, but as soon as the Russian and British Railroad join, the trip will take but 8 days. Only 500 miles are wanting for the line to be completed, but political combinations are hindering the work. Mr. Powell had passed 1 month in Moscow to study the Russian language, so difficult for strangers. Nevertheless, many English officers serving in India speak our language, and it is a great pity that the same cannot be said of the Russian officers who serve in Turkestan. Notwithstanding their long sojourn in that country, they do not speak the native language. It is quite recently that a school was organized where the Hindustani language is taught. We had also a visit from a French academician, Mr. St. Yves, a member of the French Academy, who is going to Tibet to explore the Lake Kuku Nor, and of an English engineer, Mr. Wilson, who had come to Tashkend to study the system of local irrigation. The greater part of the soil of Turkestan, as that of India, would have presented long ere this a veritable earthly paradise if it were not for the want of water. The government and the inhabitants are doing everything in their power to overcome this difficulty. They profit by the proximity of every river, and if there is no river, they dig artesian wells. The English in general are very much interested in everything concerning Turkestan. I read an article about my husband which came out in the Daily Chronicle. I quote the following from the London newspaper, quote, "Every English officer who understands the problem of Oriental politics must know of what great importance is the centralization of Russian powers in Asia. For the moment, 60,000 men are united under the command of General Doukhovsky, one of the most able officers of the Russian army." End quote. We gave a great dinner to the foreign travelers. After the end of the repast, we went into the park, illuminated with colored lanterns to let them see the dances of the bachas, native boys arrayed in woman's dress. The women in the Orient are not allowed to participate at public performances, and their parts are always taken by men. The courts of the suzerains of Central Asia and India boast of their troops of bachas, effeminate boys with long plaited hair, arrayed in sumptuous silk robes. In Tashkend, the bachas are quite different. It was grown-up youths who were brought up to us, wearing white calico shirts and heavy boots which had not seen any polish for a long time. A band of native musicians, sitting on their heels on a carpet spread upon the grass, began to beat the chords of a kind of cithern, and the would-be bachas started turning around, whilst the musicians accelerated their time. The performance could scarcely be called a dance. It was rather a swift walk within a circle. Suddenly, wild shrieks were heard, and the bachas began turning round like a spinning top, whilst the musicians accelerated their time, and the bachas made rather clumsy jumps. Our menagerie is enlarged. A native inhabitant of Tashkend presented me with a wild horse caught in the mountains, striped like a zebra, with long donkey ears. The animal was placed in the same enclosure with the reindeers, and a she-donkey was given to him as a spouse, which helped to tame the wild horse. Donkeys are very cheap in Turkestan. One can get a splendid specimen for the sum of 12 roubles, and a working ass for 5 roubles. A few miles from Tashkend, there is a leper settlement. When my husband visited it, he saw only 10 lepers. He made inquiries and was told that all the rest were begging in the streets of Tashkend. Sergei ordered them to be packed off immediately to their own dwelling. A collection for the benefit of these poor wretches is now in the press. I take part in it and publish our crossing of the Pacific Ocean from San Francisco to Yokohama. End of section 123. Section 124 of the Diary of a Russian Lady. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Ted Lienhart. The Diary of a Russian Lady by Barbara Doukhovsky. A short peep at St. Petersburg and back to Tashkend. August 10th. Today I started for St. Petersburg, where I am going to spend 2 months. There were many people to see me off. The Grand Duke was at the station. He handed me a big bouquet and a beautiful rose-colored satin box of bonbons. I received so many bouquets that my husband's aide-de-camps had not arms enough to hold them. One of the lady members of our collective book for the benefit of the lepers presented me with an enormous bouquet, bound with a white ribbon with a swallow perched on a telegraphic wire painted on it, and underneath, Revene was imprinted in golden letters, with the signature of all the writers concerned in the book. Before the train started, the Grand Duke told me he was very pleased that I entered my car holding his bouquet, without any rivals to it. August 12th. I saw a mirage today. A lake with some trees around appeared on the horizon. In the desert in fine weather, mirages are often to be seen, but they always appear in the form of water. August 13th. I arrived this morning at Krasnovodsk, where I had to wait for the steamboat until tomorrow. My car was rolled onto the pier, and 2 sentinels were placed at its door. There is stillness all around. I only heard the wash of the waves on the shore, some steps distant. It made me feel drowsy, and I soon fell asleep, lulled by the whispering ripple of the sea. August 14th. I woke at dawn. The morning dew spread around in a white mist. Somewhere in the distance a cock crowed, and another answered the challenge. At 7 o'clock I took passage on the steamer Tsarevich. The weather is splendid, the sea like a mirror. A slight breeze enters my cabin, flapping the muslin curtains. After dinner I went upon deck. On the sky bright stars were shining, and the fresh breeze swept my face. August 15th. The weather has changed for the worse. Heavy black clouds hang over the billowy sea. The wind is getting stronger. We are awfully tossed about. I have really no chance on the sea. As soon as I step on board, Neptune never fails to be very disagreeable. We arrived at Petrovsk far behind time. My car was attached to our train as far as St. Petersburg. I only spent 3 weeks on the banks of the Neva. I was miserable without Sergei, and my solitude becoming unbearable, I returned with my mother to Tashkend. We have borne the voyage capitally and had a good crossing this time. The weather was fine. The sun shone brightly on a very calm sea. We had no rolling at all. We accomplished also our journey by rail without any accident. My sudden and unexpected appearance at Tashkend created quite a commotion in the town. My mother was very much impressed by all our surroundings. To amuse her, we arranged every night card parties. There appeared to be a great number of whist players in Tashkend. Partners were never wanting. Mother's partners presented her with a green cloth with all their autographs embroidered on it. They tried to entice me into their play, but I was no card player, and at my first essay, my face openly expressed, "I am bored to death." I thrust furtive glances at the clock all the time, watching for the hands to show the hour of my deliverance. I did not repeat my experiment. Tashkend is thrown into wild agitation by the arrival of General Tutulmin, the aide of the Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolaevich. This general had been in the same military school with my husband. He was accompanied by several smart officers in the guards, Prince Jaime de Bourbon, the son of Don Carlos, among them. The prince is a legitimist claimant of the Spanish throne, serving in the Russian army in the regiment of the Hussars. He is a dashing, showy cavalry officer, of the type that finds favor with women. Like Caesar, he came, saw, and conquered. The prince is accustomed to win all hearts, and does not believe it possible for any creature of the fair sex to do so much as look at him without falling in love with him. I found him very entertaining, but did not lose my heart. He sat beside me at dinner and was very bright and witty. He told me that a gypsy had foretold him 3 things: a great gain, a wound, and a crown. The first of the predictions came true. He has won at a lottery the sum of 2,000 rubles. Will the other 2 prophecies come true? Qui verra, verra. After dinner, I mounted my bicycle, accompanied by Prince Jamie and his comrades. We made a long run. I rode fast, going at a pace almost equal to that of an express train. My cavaliers were completely exhausted, trying to keep up with me. The Emir has sent a delegation to my husband with numerous rich presents. The delegates wore beautiful culottes and white turbans made of very thin stuff, twisted round their shaved heads. These turbans cost scores of pounds. It was India which supplied them, but now they are fabricated in Moscow much cheaper. After the deputies had been presented to Sergei, they were ushered into my sitting room. The most talkative of the party was Astanakul Divanbegi, the first minister of the Emir. His companions sat down on the edge of their chairs, smoothing their knees with their hands, scarcely lifting their eyes from the carpet, and would only say yes and no. After a copious dastarkhan lunch, served in the winter garden, the deputies presented us with numerous gifts sent by their sovereign, which lay piled about the long terrace. 6 Bokharian attendants stood like ancient slaves before this amassed wealth. Superb carpets, muskets, pistols, daggers set with precious stones, gilt caskets with splendid jewelry, a dream from the 1001 Arabian Nights. We gave a grand dinner for 200 persons in honor of the delegates. An invisible band placed in the park played during the repast. Champagne flowed in abundance, and numerous toasts were drunk, accompanied by a flourish of trumpets. I sat between 2 laconic deputies, who answered with low-sounding monosyllables to all the questions I put to them with seraphic patience. I felt glad when dinner was over. That same night, I took part in a concert got up by the Benevolent Society in our house. The hall was brilliantly lighted. Every seat was taken. The Bokharian deputies were present at the concert, and I wore in their honor the heavy golden necklace presented to me by the Emir. It is fortunate that I had to play instead of singing, because for the great weight of the necklace I could not have drawn one single note out of my throat. I was seized with an access of shyness before mounting the platform, and had to swallow soothing drops to quiet my nerves. Nevertheless, I thought I should die of fright when I appeared before the audience and was conscious of an inclination to run away. But giving a swift glance to the public confronting me, I soon recovered my self-possession entirely and performed my solo on the concertina with great success, gathering frenzied bravos, and I had to play no fewer than 5 encores. All the same, I had too good sense not to understand that my success was due especially to the position I held, much more than to my talent. It was only green paper laurels that I got, and I should have liked to win real ones and play in other surroundings with veritable artists and amongst a less partial audience. The concert brought a large profit, more than £100. All the ladies who took part in it received a bouquet bound with white ribbons bearing the Red Cross. On the next day, the delegates were present at a children's feast arranged on the square opposite our house. The entertainment was given especially to attract the little natives. We wanted to tame these little savages and show them that the Russians were not so terrible as they are made to believe. The whole population, except a small part of civilized natives, bring up their children, inculcating in them the fear of the Russians. The entertainment began about 3 o'clock and went on till quite late in the evening. There were about 2,000 children. It amused me to watch their enjoyment and see the expression of mistrust stamped on their small faces, change suddenly into one of keen delight when sweets and toys were being distributed to them. It is to be hoped that the little Sartes returned to their homes carrying sentiments of friendship to the Russians in their small hearts. The opening of the agricultural exhibition took place whilst the deputies were at Tashkend. All the productions of Turkestan were gathered there: fruit, flowers, seeds, preserved vegetables, bonbons, domestic animals, etc. A great number of venomous insects, which abound in the famished steppe, were also exhibited: scorpions, phalanxes, and spiders of every kind. A mollusk, which is to be found in all the bathing establishments of Tashkend, is particularly disgusting. That little monster is scarcely perceptible in the water, being half transparent like jelly. Ugh, the horror! Summer passed quickly. Autumn came on. The dead leaves fell silently and covered the alleys of our park with a yellow carpet. In November, snow fell in abundance, and the trees bent under the heavy flakes. The trains are obliged to stop for several days, the line being encumbered with snow. On Christmas night, a group of maskers wrapped up in red dominoes, with little round bells hanging all around, appeared unexpectedly, followed by a band of music. After having performed a kind of ballet, they took off their dominoes, and we saw before us a fantastical crowd of people in fancy dress. There were clowns daubed with chalk among them, and pirates, monks, pierrots, columbines, etc. One of the aides-de-camps proved a tremendous success. He represented a gigantic doll dressed all in red and walking on stilts right up to the ceiling. In one of the corners of the big hall, suddenly a small booth appeared, in which an old wizard began selling curious advertisements. He offered, for instance, 10,000 roubles for a faithful woman. And for the fidelity of a man, it is 10 millions that he ought to offer, shouldn't he? The people who approached this booth were caught by the hook of this old man, who sprinkled them all over with scent out of an invisible sprinkler. Everybody seemed to enjoy themselves thoroughly. The floor was strewn with confetti. I did not at all like to have bits of paper poured down my back. The ballroom presented a very gay appearance, with its merry couples swinging to and fro to the music of one of Tashkend's best bands. I had not danced for years, not since I was married, and enjoyed it greatly, I must confess. We did not stop dancing till late. When the last people went away, it was broad daylight. The winter this year was a particularly severe one. The thermometer has gone down very low. Our apartments, though supposed to be thoroughly heated, are very chilly. The wind whistles down the chimney its monotonous song, and I am so dull, so dull. Oh, how I long to leave Tashkend for good and all. My wish was realized sooner than I expected. In the middle of January, my husband was called away to St. Petersburg on business. It seemed too good to be true. St. Petersburg was to me the summit of earthly bliss. I longed for the life, the beauty, the movement of the great city. January 6th. We started today for St. Petersburg. Our train advances very slowly because of the snow which covers the line. We have recourse to means used in America. A sort of brush is fastened to our engine to clear the way and sweep away the snow. January 9th. The weather is horrible. A snowstorm arose. The wind whistles and howls in the plain. Flakes of snow adhere to the glass, and it is impossible to see anything outside. January 10th. The cold keeps increasing. It is difficult to believe that it was a hot inferno I had to endure in these places not very long ago. January 11th. The cold keeps increasing. Though well wrapped up with furs, I sat shivering in the train. The pale rays of the sun appear from time to time, piercing the sky clouds, and the road covered with a heavy carpet of snow shines like diamonds. Early in the morning we arrived at Kizil-Arvat, having to stop here for 24 hours. The train could not move for the heaps of snow on the line, and soldiers were set out to clear the way for us. The principal offices of the railroad are stationed here. There is a workingmen's club with a bar, but without alcoholic drinks, a library, and a large hall where concerts and theatricals are held. It would have been desirable to increase the number of such clubs, for it is not only by tedious, boring preaching that the workmen are kept away from drunkenness, and if you made them happy and comfortable, they would not want to go off in the evening to public alehouses. January 12th. We continued our journey at daybreak. When I awoke, I found the snow had completely disappeared. Towards noon, we arrived at Krasnovodsk and took our passage on the Tropic. We are once more convinced that the geographers are often mistaken. The Caspian Sea, which never freezes according to them, appears to be frozen for 40 miles out. It is not an agreeable prospect to have to cut through the ice, but we have a compensation. We shall not be tossed about. January 13th. At dawn, we weighed anchor. It gives one the shivers to hear the ice grating against the thin body of our ship. As the Caspian never freezes, the ships are not equipped for polar crossing, and the tropic does not resemble in the least the icebreaker which was of such use to us during our crossing from Vladivostok to Nagasaki in the winter. January 14th. During the whole night we found ourselves in the position of Nansen. It is only towards morning that the sea was free from the ice. The barometer mounts visibly. The proximity of the Caucasus is perceptible. Towards night we arrived at Baku, where we have a special train placed at our disposal. The railway between Baku and Petrovsk is not open officially, and we had to advance at a snail's pace. I thought we should never get to Petrovsk if we crawled like that. January 15th. We have passed the night in the open field because the trains do not run yet in the dark. Early in the morning we began to advance at the rate of 4 miles an hour. In risky places, the guards walked on in front to examine the line. January 16th. We arrived at Petrovsk in the afternoon. We are in Europe here, and although we have got a 3 days railway journey before us, St. Petersburg seems quite near. End of section 124.
Section 125 of the Diary of a Russian Lady. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Diary of a Russian Lady by Barbara Doukhovsky. Chapter 123, Paris World's Fair. My husband's health had failed a good deal of late, and the doctors have ordered him an absolute change and rest. Sergey was overworked, and a good holiday will set him right. He wants to take a long leave and go abroad for some time. Kissingen was recommended by the doctors, but we meant to have a jolly good time and went first to Paris to visit the World's Fair. Mr. Shanievsky was nominated as representative of the Turkestan section and was sent before us to Paris. He met us at the Gare du Nord, accompanied by 4 Bulgarians and a Turkoman, sent to the exhibition to look after the rich objects exposed by the Emir, and to serve also as a vivid decoration in the Asiatic section, where the place of honor was assigned to Turkestan. These decorative personages, when passing through St. Petersburg, attracted much curiosity by their magnificent costumes. It was not astonishing, therefore, that they produced a great sensation in Paris. When our train came to stop at the platform, we saw a crowd of eager spectators waiting to see the arrival of the exotic personages whom the Orientals had come to meet, expecting to see no less a person than the Rajah. People stood on chairs to get a peep at us, and great was their disappointment when simple mortals clad in European dress stepped out of the train. We took a carriage and went to Passy, a western suburb of Paris, where in a villa overgrown with lilacs, bearing the name of Villa de Lilas, was secured for us by Mr. Shanievsky in the quietest part of Paris, in the neighborhood of the exhibition. Mr. Shanievsky had put up with his Bulgarians in a house in the Passage de Eu, described by Zola in his novel Une Page de Mort. The small Asiatic colony consists of a Bulgarian colonel, a captain, a merchant who speaks a few words of French and serves as an interpreter, and 4 servants. The Bulgarians, arrayed in rich khalats, walk about the street quite indifferent to the stare of wondering Parisians. When they go out shopping, they are taken for princes and are made to pay princely prices. One day, when visiting the Grand Magasin du Louvre, they were received at the entrance door by the directeur, surrounded by his assistants, who proposed to the prince to show them through the house, expecting to fleece the Bulgarians, who asked the price of everything they saw without any view as to purchasing them. After having visited in detail the section of jewelry, tapestry, and other fancy goods, they made the insignificant purchase of a half-a-dozen crockery plates, after which the splendid directeur and his satellites disappeared as by magic, forsaking the stingy Bulgarians. Though the exhibition has been opened a whole month, the section of Central Asia is not quite ready yet. It is only the section of Turkestan which came to an end, thanks to the energy of our delegate. Next to it are the sections of the Caucasus and Siberia. A crowd of Russian workmen wearing red shirts put the finishing stroke to them. The best place at the exhibition is assigned to Central Asia, called the Russe de Indes, quite near the Trocadero. This section, which is a duplicate in miniature of the Kremlin in Moscow, is surrounded by a high crenellated wall with a row of turrets ornamented with the Russian double eagle. When you enter it, the Russian architecture gives place to an Arabian style. An immense panorama represents a large square in Samarkand with a lively crowd of natives. Only when seen quite close one perceives that it is but a picture, not a reality. Our section is striking by its vivid and bright coloring. A fountain plays in the middle of an immense hall, decorated with beautiful Asiatic carpets and armor, and filled with all kinds of products of our possessions in Central Asia. The best appreciators of a remarkable collection of plants and seeds appear to be a legion of mice. These gnawing little animals arrange for themselves, in broad daylight, Lucilius-like repasts without being disturbed in the least by the crowd of visitors. The grains disappeared visibly, and poison was put in every attractive place, but the cunning mice, preferring the tasty grains, carried their victory onto the battlefield. Next to our Asiatic section stands the pavilion of Polar Russia. The morose Siberian nature is such a contrast with our bright Turkestan. The panels on the walls represent a seal chase. All sorts of stuffed polar animals fill the big halls, as well as an ethnographic collection of mannequins, which represents in a very lifelike manner different types of the inhabitants of Siberia. The model of a sledge, harnessed with a team of dogs, reminded me vividly of our drive on the frozen Amur during the carnival week at Khabarovsk. On long tables in the middle of the hall lay all sorts of furs, beautiful sables, blue fox, beaver, etc. It is curious that according to official information, only 7 to 8 beavers are killed yearly in Kamchatka. How can we explain then that hundreds of real beaver skins are sold in Russia? It is the fur traders only who can unriddle the thing. The Caucasus section is just opposite. In a large separate building, a panorama represents the New Siberian Railway line. The sleeping car company has exposed the model of a Trans-Caspian train composed of an engine and 3 cars belonging to the international company, in which one experiences the illusion of a journey through Siberia. The guard whistles, the train seems to move, but in reality it is only the panorama on the walls which is put into motion by a special mechanism. The travelers perceive through the windows the whole way leading from Moscow right to the terminus station, Pekin. When you pass through all the cars to the other end of the hall, you are in the Chinese section, where the front gate represents a part of the walls of the city of Pekin. The next day after our arrival at Paris, the section of Central Asia was inaugurated. To get there, we had to elbow our way through a throng. A Te Deum was sung by the singers of the Russian church, whilst all the Kremlin bells were ringing at full peal, at which my Russian heart bounded with joy. That day we spent 6 hours at the exhibition and did not sit down for 1 minute. I was awfully hungry, having eaten only 1 croissant since morning, and Sergei carried me off to the Trocadero to have dinner in one of the best restaurants. The hall was full of guests. 2 very disreputable-looking creatures sat at the table next our own. They were painted with cheap cosmetics, and the heat took off their paint, which came out in the wrong places, and very soon the powder on their faces was becoming paste, and the red on their cheeks and the back of their eyebrows began to run down in streaks, metamorphosing them into tattooed papooses, which didn't hinder them in the least from casting coquettish glances around. They tried to make eyes at my cavaliers, but it was all in vain. Their charms left them quite unmoved. We were too tired to walk home and got into a cab whose driver, with folded arms and bowed head, was nodding on his seat, his nose buried in an open newspaper. Both coachman and horse were dozing the whole way, and it is only a miracle that we got to our villa without running into other carriages. Next day, President Loubet visited our section, where he was presented with the map of France, worked in relief in a frame of jasper. The seas were made of marble, the rivers of silver, and the towns of precious stones, got from the Ural Mountains. The huge emerald representing the city of Marseille cost 8,000 rubles. President Loubet is a very different sort of person from what I had expected the ruler of France to be. He is an insignificant-looking little old man, saluting cordially from right to left. A Russian lady, who heard us speaking our mother tongue, mingled into our conversation. Before leaving our section, she favored me with a condescending nod and a limp handshake. But when she heard our interpreter addressing me by my rank, she rushed back and squeezed my finger effusively. Nasty woman. We visited that day the Algerian village in the Trocadero Gardens. Superb natives, arrayed in rich costumes, sat on the threshold of their open booths, shrieking out the virtues of their wares. Close to the village stands the Dahomey Pavilion, with its straw-thatched roof. Black natives stood on watch, perched on top of a high tower. In the Singalese village, I patted the small brown babies, calling to mind my sojourn in Colombo. We entered a barrack close by, from which resounded the frantic strains of weird native music. Inside, women, clad in oriental costumes, gleaming with golden coins on their waists and wrists, performed the danse de ventre to the accompaniment of clapping hands. One of the beautiful odaliscas stepped down from the estrade and passed round with a plate into which people dropped money. One glance was enough to show that this would-be daughter of the desert was a typical Parisienne from the Quartier de Batignolles. The pavilions of the different states are picturesquely scattered along the banks of the Seine. All these magnificent buildings, made of plaster, will be in 3 months' time reduced to the level of the Champ de Mars. One can't believe that these enormous palaces are only temporary visitors, like the people, and will be destroyed in a few months after the closing of the exhibition. It is only the Palais des Beaux-Arts, built of brick and mortar, which will not be thrown down. A most beautiful and interesting collection of old masters is exhibited in this building. We became so fascinated with some of these wonders that we could hardly get away from the place. It amused me to see how insufficiently cloaked statues upset the decorum of a pair of prim old maids in large turned-down hats surrounded by green gauze veils, unlovely and unloved creatures, belonging to that sort of Puritans who do not admit kisses because no one ever kissed them. This part of the exhibition is situated near the principal entry on the side of the Place de la Concorde, with a famous Parisian made of stone and perched very high on the top of a triumphal arch. It is queer to see the reproduction of a fashionable lady dressed up to date, posed in such a dangerous and uncomfortable place. We are accustomed to seeing symbolic figures in that risky position, defying in posture to the laws of equilibrium. There was a great crowd walking about the exhibition, a constant going to and fro of people who had come from all quarters of the globe. The human whirlpool made me quite giddy. Several bands played in different parts of the grounds near the Pont Alexandre Tray, which illustrates in stone and bronze the famous Russian Tsar. We listened to the music of an American orchestra led by Sousa, the king of marches, in like manner as Strauss and Walterfeld had been the kings of the waltzes in times of yore. Our walks through the exhibition lightened visibly our pockets. The prices of all the objects exposed for sale are exorbitant, Money melted like snow, and we came home utterly penniless. There are different means of locomotion through the great extent of the exhibition, beginning by the Tonkinois puss-puss to the last technical invention, the trottoir roulant, moving sidewalks, 3 rows of which run along without stopping. The first row moves very slowly, and it is easy to jump on it. The second row moves faster, and the third one races with the swiftness of an express train. Great agility is needed to pass from one trottoir to the other, and it happens sometimes that the backs of clumsy pedestrians rest on one trottoir, while his legs are being dragged on the neighboring one. On the Rue de Paris, near the Eiffel Tower, different attractions are to be found: bearded women, mermaids, and other marvels of past, present, and future life. In a Miorama, we crossed from Marseille to Constantinople without leaving Paris. Another panorama gives the illusion of a sea voyage round the world. In the Palais d'Optiques, we went down under the sea and were introduced to horrid monsters. We came upon a gigantic telescope showing the moon at a distance of 60 kilometers. A huge wheel, 177 meters high, with 32 wagons, wheels round intrepid passengers. The Palais de la Femme contains amazing toilettes of past and ultra-modern times. I fell in love with the costume of the last note of modernity, which Sergi wanted to purchase, but I was reasonable enough to refuse the present, for the price was unheard of. The panorama de Mont Blanc shows a group of excursionists climbing up the Alps, which reminded me of our ascent on the Mont Blanc. To come into the Vieux Paris, representing the Paris of past centuries, we had to cross a drawbridge and enter through a tower gate guarded by sentinels of the Middle Ages, holding long lances, into the Rue de Ramparts, a corner of a street in the 14th century, with dwellings filled with medieval attributes. On the front of the houses, instead of numbers, the pictures of different birds are reproduced. In the narrow, tortuous streets, we found ourselves surrounded by people dressed according to the fashion of ancient times. Knights in armor and ladies of the Middle Ages walked to and fro. My imagination traveled, transporting me to the days of long ago, and I felt as if the clock had been put back several centuries. When we passed the Tour de Châtelet, the 14th century had vanished by magic into the time of the Tudors, making a jump through the space of over 200 years. Chants resounded from the Church of St. Julian, which belonged formerly to the Minstrels' Brotherhood. On the square we saw the gibbet, watched over by musketeers armed with muskets and wearing 3-cornered hats. In the Rue de Vieille-École, the house inhabited by Molière is exactly reproduced. Ladies in panniers and powdered perucas promenaded, escorted by their cavaliers dressed as marquesses. Different processions circulated. Here is a band of clerks directing their steps toward the Court of Justice, with inkstands adjusted to their girdles, carrying in their hands burning torches. In the criminal hall, instead of lawsuits, mysteries are represented. Not far from the Vieux Paris is the Andaluse de Tombe de Moret. The entry represents the exact copy of the Alcazar in Seville on the Plaza de Toro. Instead of horrid bullfights, pretty Andalusian gitanas, Spanish gypsies, with a rose placed above the left ear in their jet-black hair, danced seguidillas and habaneras. It was fire which ran in their veins. I was very much astonished to see our Turcoman promenading among the audience. We were told that the impresario had invited him to come every night, gratis, to his establishment as a living decoration. I cannot conceive what can be in common between an inhabitant from Central Asia and Spanish life. Opposite Andalusia, an alpine village has spread itself ungeographically, with its cattle, shepherds, watchmaker shops, and wooden toy makers. Amidst natural glaciers and waterfalls, an animated crowd dressed in the costumes of all the Swiss cantons walk about. We saw the house where Bonaparte passed the night on his march with his army of 30,000 men across the St. Gothard Pass, with all the furniture just as it was then. There was the armchair by the hearth in which the great man sat, gazing into the glowing coals. What pictures did he see in the flames? Did his thoughts wander back to Josephine or to new laurels and glory? The exhibition opened at 10. We went there as soon as the gates were thrown open and left it only when we found ourselves almost too tired to stand. We met there many friends from Russia, Mr. Rad amongst them, director of the museum in Tiflis, an eminent biologist versed in all the antiquities and questions of the past. He is awfully absent-minded and always looking as if he just descended from the clouds. One day when Mr. Rad called upon us at the Villa de Lilas, he made the acquaintance of our landlord, who had nothing of the Adonis about him, with his round moon face and a tiny baby nose disappearing between his fat cheeks. In a fit of absent-mindedness, he began to pity the cherub-faced gentleman for having such a terrible inflammation, and on both sides of the face all the more. Our landlord thanked him for his compassion, but said that happily he never suffered from toothache, and was not afflicted, therefore, with inflammation of any kind. I had to make a desperate effort to be serious when witnessing this comic scene. We knew our Paris well and had a jolly good time at night, enjoying theaters and cafés chanants. I did feel gay going to naughty places in the quarter Montmartre without caring whether it was proper or not. At the Chat Noir, the program was very varied, exhibiting celebrities dressed in a costume remarkable for its lack of stuff, and famed for the height to which they could raise one leg and knock their own noses with it while standing upon the other. We visited the Cabaret du Ciel and the Cabaret de l'Enfer, two rather disreputable establishments with quaint representations of bliss in heaven and tortures in hell. In the first cabaret, the customers are received by a bevy of white-winged, long-haired masculine beings, and in the second one, an establishment where the lights blaze red, the attendants, attired as devils, greet the visitors, making demonic grimaces. The Cabaret Alexandre Briand is very amusing. The proprietor of this establishment well merits his surname of Briand, noisy. He meets his guests shouting in a voice of thunder and making mocking jeers. When an old lady with orange-colored hair and a very powdered face came in, he exclaimed, "Oh, la belle brune! Ne l'a-t-elle pas un teint éclatant?" Oh, the dark beauty! Hadn't she got a dazzling complexion? A general laugh arose. Then he came up to me and, patting my shoulder, roared, "Pauvre petite créature, comme elle a l'air maladif." Poor little thing, how ailing and sickly she looks. The newcomers, feeling rather scared of being addressed in such a rough manner, and displeased at being made to appear ridiculous, wanted to get away, but when they saw that this queer reception was one of the peculiarities of the house, they settled themselves comfortably at separate little tables, and laughed in their turn good-humoredly at the reception of new arrivals. The distribution of prizes at the exhibition took place a few days before we left Paris. My husband received for our Turkestan section the Great Cross of the Legion d'Honneur. The Russian commissaire, when packing up different objects, found it difficult to bring back to Tashkend a huge arba, a two-wheeled cart, and it was decided to leave it here and present it to some collector of curiosities. But no one wanted such a gift, and the commissaire had recourse to another means of getting rid of this encumbering arba. They asked the carter, promising him a good tip, to harness his horse to the cart and take it along as far as a highway leading to Versailles, and then leave it there to its own fate. End of section 125, read by Brize Cries, Ohio. Section 126 of the Diary of a Russian Lady. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Diary of a Russian Lady by Barbara Doukhovsky. Chapter 124, Kissingen. Every day in Paris was too short for me, and I left the great Babylon with immense regret. Sergey went to Kissingen to begin his cure, and I returned to St. Petersburg to publish my book. About a week after my arrival, I was on my way to Kissingen. Sergey wrote to me, entreating me to come, as he couldn't do without me, and had been very miserable since we parted. He said that he would give up his cure and start for St. Petersburg if I would not rejoin him. I telegraphed back that I was starting off immediately. Spoilt by the comforts of my travels in Turkestan, I felt very uncomfortable in a train full of passengers. We were crowded together like herrings in a barrel. I squeezed myself into my place in the corner of the carriage, pressing close my elbows. My fellow passengers were going straight to Berlin, and I couldn't stretch my legs the whole night to get the cramp out of them. We looked at one another with no great love in our eyes. I was placed by the side of a well-preserved lady of about 50 years of age, trying to pass off for 30, who had still the remains of what she had been in her young days and did not like to part with them. I caught her practicing her fascinations in the mirror. She was accompanied by her daughter, a grown-up girl of about 18, clad in a short frock, with her hair down her back in a plait. When I heard them say, "I reckon," I knew they were Americans. My neighbor opened her basket and offered part of her supper to me. She was most communicative respecting her own concerns, and chatted away like a magpie. She told me that they were going to do Paris, and spoke all the time of her conquests, stating to me that she had got all the men at her feet. I scarcely listened to her prattle, but she chatted on, accustomed to do without answers. Opposite me sat a full contrast to that chatterbox, a placid materfamilias endowed with 3 babies, aged respectively 5, 4, and 2, who kept singing praises to the many charms and wondrous perfection of her offsprings. The children were petted and fondled by their mother, who crammed them all the way with bonbons and cake in profusion. Her little girl, hugging in her arms an immense doll, began quarreling with her brother, an ugly and anything but well-behaved brat, with nose and mouth blackened with chocolate. They kicked and screamed until they were both black in the face. I only just stopped short of throwing my book at their heads. The baby, the pet of the family, was cutting a tooth and kept roaring the whole night. We arrived early in the morning at the frontier of Prussia. At the customs, my trunks were unmercifully turned topsy-turvy, the horrid officials stirring them up as I used to do with my nursery pudding when all the plums had sunk to the bottom. When we approached Kissingen, I thrust my head out of the railway carriage, with my body half out of the window, to catch the first sight of my husband's face. As we drew up at the station, I perceived him on the platform, beaming with delight. I jumped out of the train joyfully, and the next moment I was in Sergey's arms. Kissingen is surrounded by mountains and buried in verdure. It is the favorite meeting place for aristocratic Europe. There is a great rush of ailing humanity towards these healing waters. I found Sergey comfortably established in a villa belonging to Dr. Sautier, by whom he was treated. The next day I accompanied my husband when he made his visit to the doctor. The drawing room was crowded with patients who had arrived from all parts of the world. They perused magazines and plunged their heads into large books of photographs, awaiting their turn to appear before the Esculapius. Early in the morning, as soon as I heard the postilion sounding his horn, I hastened to jump out of bed and accompanied Sergey to the Kurhaus, where he took his waters. A beautiful string orchestra entertained the Kurhaus guests from 6 to 8. The sick, undergoing a cure, walk in the broad alley, carrying their glasses with them. They stroll from one spring to another, sipping the water on the way. We saw invalids in wheeled chairs, basking in the sun with a shawl over their legs, discussing and comparing their various diseases. The outskirts of Kissingen are beautiful. We made long walks every afternoon. Exercise gave me a ravenous appetite, and I was far from being satisfied with our meager dinner when we returned home, being put on a low diet like my husband, for company's sake. We were kept with a discipline that was worse than that of a convent, and we were all put to bed at 9 o'clock, in accordance with the doctor's order. I didn't like at all to be under hospital rules, and began to revolt against this tedious discipline. At the end of 3 days, I longed for change of air and surroundings, and wanted much to run away. I am sick to death of seeing the same faces every day, and of hearing the same sort of talk of people drinking disgusting waters, and occupied only with the engrossing pastime of taking care of one's health. We have also become imaginary sufferers, and very often came upon Maria Mikhailovna looking at her tongue in the glass. The weather is bad again. It is raining all the time. The sick are promenading, sulky and morose under their umbrellas, emptying their glasses in a melancholy way. Sergei has accomplished his cure at Kissingen. The treatment had proved successful, and his health was now gradually returning. I felt reassured for the moment. But Sergei, instead of seeking a spot for an after-treatment, hastened back to Tashkend, where he at once resumed his work, which had become more complicated than ever thanks to the Boxers' rising in China. The foreign diplomats living in Peking are besieged by a hostile crowd of natives. The Boxers have attacked the newly built Manchurian Railway. When my husband was Governor General of the Amur provinces, and there was no sign whatever of a misunderstanding between China and European countries, he formed a project of building a railway line across the Amur banks. Being against the construction of the Manchurian Railway on a foreign land, but he was not listened to, and we see now the deplorable consequences. End of section 126, read by Brize Cries, Ohio. Section 127 of the Diary of a Russian Lady. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Diary of a Russian Lady by Barbara Doukhovsky. Chapter 125, Back to Tashkend for the Last Time. Meanwhile, I had a very tedious time at St. Petersburg, where I was to remain until autumn. It is odd that Sergei had not written to me for quite 10 days. I was tortured by the fear that something had happened to him. I got at last a letter in which he told me that his health had changed again for the worse, and that he pined for me to such an extent as to lose his appetite and sleep, and that his lips had forgotten to smile. I must come back and cheer him a bit. Such a longing for Sergei came over me that I decided to leave for Tashkend on the following day. I was in a fever to reach the end of my journey, and it seemed to me that the train was creeping at a snail's pace. At one of the stations I received a telegram from Mr. Shaniovsky, informing me that my husband was unwell and that the doctors had ordered him to remain in bed. I was awfully upset by that telegram, and my spirits sank lower and lower. I was haunted in the night by a nightmare of frightful reality. I stood before the cathedral in Tashkend, surrounded by a crowd of soldiers. Suddenly an officer came out of the church and announced in a loud voice, "General Doukhovsky has just passed away." Oh, the horror of it! I woke in tears with a start full of agony. The more the time drew near for my arrival at Tashkend, the more nervous I became. My impatience increased from minute to minute. One can well imagine my amazement when, stopping at the station nearest to Tashkend, I saw my husband on the platform. He had left his bed to come and meet me. Sergey met me open-armed, whilst my heart beat so violently that I feared he would hear it. He had altered a good deal, and I was awfully shocked by the drawn look of his features. There was a large lump in my throat, and I could not speak for the risk of tears, but I made a strong effort, and trying to conceal my anxiety, I forced a poor smile, and did my utmost to look composed and cheerful. As soon as we arrived at Tashkend, Sergey went to bed again, but was all right on the following morning. The sight of my face was the best medicine he could have. The clouds thickened on the political horizon, and questions concerning China began to occupy the public mind. The European powers, feeling alarmed, marched conjointly on Pekin. There were 30,000 troops assembled there. They say that Russia is going to take an active part, and we have to apprehend a catastrophe any moment on the frontier of Turkestan. Our Russian consul, who did not feel safe at Kolja, a Chinese town near our frontier, asked my husband to send a platoon of Cossacks to protect him. My husband's governorship was not a bed of roses. It was a difficult career, requiring much patience, perseverance, and delicate handling. Sergey did not know fatigue, working from early morning till late at night, and even when he went to bed, he tried to remember the things he had done and the things he had to do, instead of falling off to sleep. He was a man who had never seemed to flinch from duty, either for himself or others, and he required the same from his subordinates, but didn't find the necessary support in them he ought to have had in such troublesome times. He looks awfully careworn and worn out. The doctor spoke again of rest and change, and Sergey applied for leave. He thought of resigning altogether, to my greatest joy. End of section 127, read by Brize Cries, Ohio.
Section 128 of the Diary of a Russian Lady. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Christine Bowden. The Diary of a Russian Lady by Barbara Doukhovsky. Definite departure for St. Petersburg. I counted the last hours of my stay at Tashkend. At last the happy day of our departure arrived. Swarms of people came to see us start and wish us a happy journey and a safe and speedy return to them. The leave-taking was very warm. How happy I should have been to say goodbye to Tashkend forever. Au revoir, said my lips, and adieu whispered to me the presentiment that we shall never meet again. The train began to move amidst loud cheers. I stood at the window of my car with my arms full of flowers, exchanging smiles and nods. We are back at St. Petersburg. I am so happy to push etiquette aside and live the life of a simple mortal, but the sword of Damocles was hanging over my head all the time. My husband's illness had taken a sudden turn for the worse. He became thinner and paler every day, and the doctors ordered him a complete rest. This put an end to Sergei's hesitations, and he begged the emperor to permit him to reassign his post in Turkestan. On New Year's Day, my husband was named member of the State Council. Oh, how blessed it was to have done with Tashkend and all. Our wandering life was over now. The thing I had longed for year after year. I lulled myself with such sweet dreams for the future, but my joy was a short one. I soon saw sinister black clouds darkening my bright sky. Sergei was sinking fast and was confined to his bed. I hated to see him in pain and would have given all my blood to save him, but the Almighty predetermined it otherwise. On March 1, my beloved husband passed away. The awful circumstances of my dream during my railway journey to Tashkend were realized, and the world suddenly took a cold and dismal aspect. Everything around and within me grew dark and chill. Ever since I was born, good fortune had marked me her own. There were many fairies at my cradle. Life had been too smooth for me, and so it took vengeance now for all my felicity of bygone years. The Emperor was present at a requiem mass sung in our house. His Majesty said kind words of condolence to me, but I scarcely heard them. Happiness, peace, all that was scattered to the ground like a house built on sand. Nothing remained of it. There are griefs that are too deep to speak of, and too secret for pen and ink. I end my remembrances by these sad words. Sic transit gloria mundi. The end. End of section 128. End of The Diary of a Russian Lady by Barbara Doukhovsky.